Welcome everyone. My name is Jordan Ben-Shia. I'm the Executive Director of the VIN Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us for the Class of 2020 Student Loan Playbook webinar. And first and foremost, I want you all to know that this is being recorded and you will all receive a recording of this webinar. We will be sending out an email within the next couple days with a recording of the webinar, a PDF checklist, as well as additional links and information. So a few housekeeping tips for the webinar. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Please use that for any questions. And if you find that somebody's asking a question that you find really interesting or you want to make sure is answered, you can choose to upvote and give that a thumbs up, and that'll go to the top of our question sheet to make sure that we respond to. We will try to get through all of our questions. Myself, Jordan Ben-Shia will be here, Dr. Paul Payan is also here, and Dr. Matt Holland is also here, and we'll be in the background answering questions and making sure that we are here to hopefully give you the best experience possible. You'll hear me every once in a while chiming in to give Tony some relevant questions as he discusses the different topics. Again, thank you so much for all being here. We're very grateful for spending your time with us. And again, any questions you have, please put them in the Q&A. It makes it a lot easier for us to track those and keep track of them instead of in the chat window. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tony Bartels. Thanks, Tony.
All right. Thank you, Jordan. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Congratulations, if it's a little bit early or if you've already graduated. Let me be one of the first to congratulate you and welcome to the veterinary profession officially as doctors. I know it's a little bit different. Your class is going to be kind of the, I guess, the outlier when it comes to not necessarily having a formal commencement. I apologize for that. I wish that that could be different. Unfortunately, we've got this pandemic and all this uncertainty that we're working through. And then on top of that, you're starting your careers as veterinarians and also trying to navigate student loan repayment, right? So just to add a little bit more stress on top of all the other stress. So hopefully tonight we're going to try to make student debt a little bit less stressful for you as you're getting started, no matter what you're going to be doing here shortly. Feel free to type your questions in. We'll try to get to them along the way if we can, or at the end we'll stick around and answer as many questions as you have, right? So this is really focused on just getting you started in loan repayment. I'm giving you the information. We'll even go through some demos here of how, logistically, how you can actually get this repayment process started. Because you're there right now. All that stuff that we may have talked about as part of VBMA or through your curriculum, if you've seen the Climbing Mount Debt discussions before, all that stuff that we talked about before, you're ready to do. Right, so we're almost ready to do. We'll talk about that too, why we have graduate officially there. So we can thank the pandemic for that. So we'll get started and we'll go through this and try to stay to this structure, but we're really here just to kind of answer all of your questions, give you some of the background information to make this process as easy as possible. I do have one poll. Most of the information that you all did as the homework beforehand kind of remove the need for the polls, but I do want to do one poll about, of course, COVID-19. So you should see a poll there, hopefully, and check all that apply for you, right? It might take you a little bit to read some of those, but we're really trying to understand, how is this impacted, particularly your graduating class. All right, looks like about 80% of you have voted.
Tony, a couple are saying that they are not seeing the poll. It's possible that if you're not seeing the poll, that it's behind a window. It's a pop-up window, and if you're not able to see the last questions, you can scroll within the poll window, and hopefully from there you'll be able to see the last question. and you can let us know if there's still an issue there.
I do know too, if you're using a mobile device or some kind of computing thing that acts as a mobile device, sometimes the polls are a little funky as well.
Yeah, I'm hearing that that they're not able to scroll all the way down to see the bottom options.
That's interesting. I mean, I see that some people have found that, because I see some people have gotten to the bottom. I'll leave that open for just a couple more seconds. I mean, it looks like we got 92% of the folks have voted.
That's above your average, so that's pretty good.
Yeah, 93 now. Wow, look out. Okay, all right. Let me. Maybe a few people found that. Let me go ahead and end this here. Then we will share the results. So it looks like the majority of you are doing pretty much what 60% of you are doing what you were scheduled to do, and then the rest of you kind of fall along a smattering of the rest. For those of you that have been impacted, we are going to talk a little bit about that in terms of particularly if your plans have been canceled or if your position has started later than planned. All right. Well, thank you for doing that. And then thank you too for everybody who completed the homework assignment and finding that. I know we made it a little bit difficult on you. That was just kind of logistically the best way we had to do that, because we didn't want anybody but the 2020 class in that particular form. But really that is to help you start to wrap your head around the types of information you're going to need in order to start this loan repayment process. And we're going to use some of the data from that particular signalment form to illustrate a lot of the concepts that we're going to go through tonight. All right. So let's start first by talking a little bit about that student debt and income signalment. And this is really why I'm so passionate about this too. But so I'm going to share a little bit with you my student debt signalment. So I'm a married 2-vet household with no kids yet. We're Colorado State University DVMs. My wife finished before I did. She went on to specialize in small animal internal medicine, and she practices in Denver, where I'm sitting now. And I went more the GP route. My wife was an out-of-state student. I was an in-state student. I did a combined MBA DVM. Thought I was doing all the things I was supposed to do in order to keep my costs down. And then I married my wife, who had even more student debt than I did, right? So that happens sometimes too. Some of you even ask questions about that. We can talk about that tonight as well. So combined, we have student debt in excess of $400,000, right? So this is why I'm particularly passionate about this issue and passing on what we've learned to you all. But if you do nothing with your student loans during this period between graduation and the end of your grace period, they will put you in a standard 10-year plan, right? So a standard 10-year plan is essentially, they calculate that payment amount based on the amount that you borrowed, the interest rate, and the payment that's required to extinguish that balance in 10 years or 120 monthly payments. So for us, that would have been $4,500 a month. That was more than we were taking home at the time. So that really isn't a very realistic repayment plan. The standard 10-year plan is not a very realistic repayment plan for most graduating veterinarians, right? So that's why we had to look elsewhere. Stumble upon these income-driven repayment options. So IBR being one of the earlier versions of this. As the name implies, the payment is a function of your income. So that had us down to $1,400 a month. And then we switched to a plan, and we currently use a plan called Revised Pay-As-You-Earn, or REPAY. And that got our payment down to $930 a month, right? So different plans will have different monthly payment amounts. If you're astute, you're going to know that that $930 payment is not going to cover the interest on a $400,000 loan. So we accumulate interest, right? So our loan balance grows, but the trade-off for that is our monthly payment is manageable, and it allows us to have a financial plan that involves something other than paying back our student loans. Now, that also means that we're very likely to hit student loan forgiveness. So as many of you may already know, or you're starting to hear, if you use an income-driven repayment plan, you only get a specified period of time in order to pay back your student loans. And if you hit that maximum repayment period and you still have a balance left, the remainder gets forgiven. Essentially, it's canceled, and then the IRS treats that as taxable income. So my wife and I are anticipating hitting forgiveness, and we are about halfway to our forgiveness target with about 17 years left to go in repayment. in regards to COVID-19, right, this is where we've seen one of the impacts. The CARES Act, that is legislation that was passed a few weeks ago, has paused the interest, which you all have likely noticed, right? So the interest on your federal student loans has been suspended, as well as the payment has been suspended for those of us in repayment, right? So our payments are zero right now. We're not accruing any interest, but we're also receiving credit for that time towards forgiveness, which is an excellent bonus, right? So again, you never know what's going to happen, but that particular legislation has actually made income-driven repayment even more beneficial, and we can piggyback off of that and use some of that information to help you all get started as well. So that's where you went and did your student debt and income signalment form. For those of you that have completed that, right, this is how all of this is going to start to come together. So for those of you that were able to submit and upload your file through that form, you're already familiar with this, right? So you found your student aid data file. I did get some emails from folks that were having some difficulty finding that student aid data file, so we can go through that here. But you're going to find in there direct loans. If you started school or any kind of school where you borrowed student loans before July 1st, 2010, you might have what are called Federal Family Education Loans or FFEL program loans. And you may even have Perkins loans, right? The Perkins loan program was discontinued, I believe, in 2018. So there hasn't been any new Perkins loans, but you may have some older ones depending on when you started your education. What you're not going to find in there are health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students, private loans, any family loan arrangements or other loans. And a lot of you indicated those. So we'll go through what you showed me essentially. So all of these loans that you find in this student aid data file on studentaid.gov, these are federally held student loans, and that's really important when it comes to the CARES Act, right? Because those are the loans that are covered by the CARES Act. Those loans that you find in that file on that website are the loans that are specifically covered under that CARES Act. Health professional student loans and loans for disadvantaged students are still a type of federal student loan, but they live outside of that system. So if you were to consolidate those into a federal direct student loan, then they would also be eligible not only for the income-driven plans we're going to talk about, but they also then become eligible for the CARES Act suspension and non-payment that we were talking about previously. So let's go over to studentaid.gov, and if any of you had a hard time looking or finding this file, we're going to use this image as kind of a guide to get us there. So I'm going to head over there. It's going to open up a browser. I'll drag that over to this screen.
Tony, while you're doing that, just a couple questions.
Yep.
One, someone asked, you said you and your wife are halfway to forgiveness, but you have 17 years left.
We are halfway to our savings target, right? So we have been investing for that forgiveness, right? And that the amount that we've allocated for forgiveness is 50% to the target amount that we anticipate having for that tax, but we're not nearly halfway through repayment, right? So we're ahead of schedule, if you will, in terms of forgiveness planning. And that largely has been, I can give a lot of credit to that, to the economy that we've had up until COVID-19, right? So, I mean, depending on how you choose to plan for forgiveness, if you subject some or all or, minimal amounts of that to investments that track the stock market, then you can get some pretty decent returns. And we've seen some pretty decent returns the last several years, again, up until about 2 months ago, right? So that will probably adjust itself out. But again, that's why I'm also thankful we have about 17 years before we would hit forgiveness, so we can absorb those kind of blips. But we're jumping way ahead. But that's why, right? That's why we're halfway to our target, but we still have more than half of our time left before we hit forgiveness. All right, so studentaid.gov, here's the page that you're going to want to go to. You're going to log in. You're going to log in using the same username and password that you've been applying for your student loans or your financial aid. All the scary language that they throw in front of you before you get in there. And now this just has been redesigned really a couple of months ago, and there used to be several different websites, but now it's all from one landing page essentially. So studentaid.gov is where you can do everything. So this is a a snapshot of what my loans look like right now, right? So I have $164,000 of principal and $7,700 of unpaid interest. We'll talk about what that unpaid interest is. It shows you your loan servicers. The information in here is still confusing, even though they kind of pared it down. So again, we built the tools on VIN Foundation, the Student Debt Center, to help you navigate this stuff, because the federal tools are just not sufficient, right? So they get you part of the way, but they don't get you nearly as far as you need to go. So what you're looking for in that aid summary, or the detail link that I clicked on, here, let me go back to there. This is called the dashboard. I got ahead of myself. And then I clicked on this view details link, right? So if I click on that view details link, it's going to take me to another page that has the details of my student loans, or some of the details. And then I'm looking for this download my aid data, right? This is going to generate that ugly looking text file that many of you submitted with your debt and income signalment, right? So that's the link that will generate this. Now, you probably can't do this on a phone. We've tested this on mobile devices, and since many of the mobile devices don't do well downloading files to those devices, this link isn't even available, like if you try to do it via iPhone. So you may have to use something that mimics more of a laptop in order to access this information. But your student aid data file is going to be what contains all of the pertinent information to help you make decisions, right? So you click on that and it'll download the ugly looking text file to your computer. You can save that, and then we take it and put it into the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool. But before we do that, let's come back here and look at a little bit more of this information. So what are you going to find in that student aid data file? For the most part, it's going to be these direct loans. You know, you guys are graduating as 2021. Direct loans are pretty much the only loan type that you probably have. Now, there might be some non-traditional students that started school before 2010, and you have a variety of other loan types, and those might show up in there, right? But for the majority of you, you're probably only going to see direct loans. And I do see that a lot of people get tripped up by this. I can see that from the signalment form, where a lot of you indicated you had other loans and you were putting grad plus loans in there, or subsidized loans from undergrad, right? I mean, those are still direct loans as long as they have direct in the name. They just weren't loans from veterinary school maybe, right? Or the direct grad plus loans are loans that you get in veterinary school if you exceed the thresholds of the direct unsubsidized loans, right? So you're really, you know, the direct grad plus is really a subtype of the direct loan. Direct unsubsidized is a subtype of a direct loan, right? So you're looking for loans that have direct in the name, right? Those are going to be the most flexible and easy to work with. All right, so based on what you told me, 98% of you have federal student loans, so those that fall into this direct FEL or Perkins category. 18% of you had health profession student loans, 3% loans for disadvantaged students. 13% of you had private student loans. I was a little surprised by that. It was higher than I was assuming. I mean, I'm not sure if those are from veterinary school, or maybe they were from before veterinary school. Private loans do tend to complicate things a little bit, but we will talk about that. Just a few of you had family loans, and some of you indicated that you had other loans. But again, some of those other loans that you indicated are probably federal loans based on the data that I saw in there. All right, so how can you differentiate federal versus private loans? Because that comes up a lot too. So you're looking again for that direct in the name, right? So doing an inventory of your loans, the first place you're going to start is studentaid.gov, and you're going to pull that file. Those are definitely federal student loans. But if you have health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students, those are a little bit harder to keep track of, right? So they're usually dispersed through the school, right? So you might find them in your school financial aid account. And then after you graduate, they will usually shuttle those to a third-party loan servicer, right? But they're still of that type that you can consolidate. You just have to know how to keep track of them. If it doesn't have direct in the name, or Stafford, or if they're variable interest rates, they have interest rates that are less than 5%, if you're lucky, or if they're more than 9%, then they're probably not a federal student loan. If the loan name contains a bank in it, like this one over here, Scotiabank, right? I mean, those are private student loans, right? So that's a giveaway, right? So here's an example of some of the loans that you all wrote in, right? So consolidation loan, that is probably a federal student loan. It might be a FFEL consolidation, but it's probably a consolidation loan. Grad Plus loans are federal student loans all the time. These institutional loans, be careful, because sometimes they refer to the health profession student loans and loans for disadvantaged students sometimes get referred to as institutional loans, but that can also refer to loans that you take directly from the school you went to, right? Now, if they're health profession student loans or loans for disadvantaged students, then you can consolidate them into your direct consolidation loan, and they would be eligible for all the income-driven repayment plans. But if they are actually loans that are owned by your school, right, then they would not be eligible, right? So you may have to do a little bit of legwork to figure that out, or you can email me and ask. But usually we can figure out whether they're a health profession student loan or a loan that's directly from your school. Giveaway here, the Purdue Plus loans, I'm pretty sure that's a Purdue specific loan, right? So that's not a federal student loan. Robert Young, I'm familiar with those. I think those are Michigan State students. So Perkins loans here, undergrad, those are likely federal student loans. I don't know about the university loans, right? So you might have to look into that a little bit more closely. But these ones with the red X here are not likely, or highly unlikely to be any kind of federal student loan. And we've already kind of gone through the institutional loan one there. If you lost track, maybe you're not even finding everything that you think you have, this is a great time to check your credit report, right? So you're eligible to get a free credit report from the 3 major reporting entities once per year. This is a great time to do that, right? So grab that credit report from all 3 of those reporting entities and see what your credit report shows. You should see your student loans on one, if not all of those credit reports, and make sure that you're not missing anything, right? Because you'll be amazed. Sometimes you can lose track of these things as long as some of them spend in school. All right, so let's just talk about the CARES Act briefly, right? So this is the recent legislation due to COVID-19. So there's really 5 pillars that address student loans, right? So the 4 here is the suspension of payment, right? For those of us who are under payment, no accrual of interest, right? So that applies to you as well, and anybody that has those federally held student loans, any of those loans that are in the studentaid.gov data file. And then if you were in bankruptcy and working towards rehab on any loans, or you had some loans in collection, all of that stuff is stopped too for those specifically federally held student loans. You didn't have to do anything for this to happen. It was done automatically, right? You didn't have to apply for it. Your loans are automatically put into what they're calling an administrative forbearance, which stops the interest and has stopped the payments. They also threw in a little perk. So if any of you are starting a job this year with an employer who is planning to make student loan contributions towards your student loans, those are now tax deductible, but only through the end of this year, right? So we may see that be the door opening to more tax beneficial student loan contributions. But if you do have an employer that's offering this, you will get the added benefits of those contributions being tax-free up to $52.50 for this tax year. All right, so what does federally held mean? And we've kind of already beaten that one up, but it's all your direct loans, some federal family education loans, some Perkins loans, health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students are not federally held student loans unless you consolidate them. And then private loans, there's no way to make them eligible for the CARES Act. So who is the loan owner? So the easiest way to probably figure that out is to use that data file that you already obtain from studentaid.gov and upload it into the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool. So let's come on over here and do that. So I've got a couple of samples here. So vinfoundation.org. Then we're looking at the My Student Loans tab up here. Graduated, so you're graduated veterinary school. We will upload that file. Let me find the files that I am trying to get to. There it is. Okay, so I've got 2 different examples I want to show you because the Department of Education has been tinkering around this week that has really kind of done some interesting things. So we're going to take all of that ugly data that's in that text file and turn it into something that you can use, right? So we're going to show you your principal, your unpaid interest. We used to be able to show you your weighted average interest rate, right? So all of your different loans, depending on when you borrowed them, will have different interest rates. But this is what the Department of Education has been tinkering around with the last few days. So I think it has something to do with the CARES Act. So some of you, when you upload your file, depending on when you obtained your file, particularly if you obtained it in the last few days, you may see that your interest rate doesn't show anything. Right, and that's because they removed all of the interest rate data from those files. And I think it's because they were having a hard time turning off the interest. Right, so the way that they're doing that is actually taking the interest rates out. So it does complicate things unless you kind of knew what your interest rates were before. It's going to be hard to know what to use as the interest rate input, maybe until the end of this CARES Act. Right, so this is just kind of a side effect of what the Department of Education is trying to do to logistically accomplish the law that was passed, right? So we do see that there's a 0% interest rate in here, but we can move past that, right? There's other things in here that we want to look at. So how do I know if my loans or all my loans are federally held? I can go to my loan servicer tab, and as long as Department of Ed is listed here, right, Department of Ed / Navient. This means that the Department of Education owns these loans and Navient is the loan servicer, right? So these are an example of loans that are eligible for the CARES Act. So let me upload, if I upload my file, I have a good example of loans that don't qualify for the CARES Act. I have a small balance that is ineligible for that. So I'm going to come back to here. And actually, I'm going to upload my file that has the interest rates. So in my file, if I go to the loan servicer tab, I see that I have a bulk of my loans are owned by the Department of Education and serviced by Great Lakes, but I also have this small balance from undergrad that is owned by Navient outright, right? So Navient can be a loan servicer, but they can also be a loan owner, right? And this is the differentiation here. So Department of Ed qualifies for the CARES Act suspension. Navient Solutions without Department of Ed does not, right? So that's another one of those indications that you have loans that qualify for the CARES Act. If I come back over here, so this is our Tufts graduate. The other really relevant piece of information that we're going to talk more about is this income-driven repayment eligibility, right? So you are, the income-driven repayment plans have some very strict eligibility requirements, and they are all dictated by your loan types and when you started borrowing, right? So we can see here that this person is eligible for the older version of IBR, pay as you earn, and revised pay as you earn. So I shared with you earlier that my wife and I are using revised pay as you earn, and that's because we do not qualify for pay as you earn, right? Pay as you earn has the most strict qualification requirements. If you had a student loan before October 1st, 2007, and you didn't pay that balance to zero before you started borrowing again after that date, then you won't qualify for pay as you earn either. It's an all or nothing thing, right? So if you do qualify for pay as you earn, it tends to be the most beneficial repayment plan. Now there are certain exceptions to that, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. So this is an example of some of the really good information that you're going to find in this My Student Loans tool. If I come back here and upload the other example that I have that has interest rates, then you can get an idea of what's, the value of being able to calculate your weighted average interest rate, right? Because I think a lot of people get tripped up by different loans with different interest rates, and they want to do a whole lot of different things with those loans, right? So they want to pay this one, that one, or the other one, right? So we do a weighted average interest rate for two reasons. One, it kind of makes it as if it's a single loan, right? And it makes it easier to project the costs and different repayment strategies that way. But this is also what the Department of Education does if you do a direct consolidation loan, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, right? So if I take all of these loans in this portfolio and I consolidate them, my weighted average interest rate is going to be 5.98. They will actually round it up in this case to 6, but then I can sign up for auto pay and get a 0.25% interest rate reduction, right? So this gives you an idea of what you can expect your direct consolidation loan interest rate to be. This is kind of the kicker of them taking all the interest rates out of the files, right? We're unable to do that for everybody until they put that interest rate data back in there. But if your interest rate data is still in here, then we can still do that calculation for you. If not, you're going to have to kind of take your best guess of what that weighted average interest rate is going to be for the time being. All right. So this has come up as a result of the CARES Act, and this is going to be relevant once you get your loans into repayment. So the law talks about a suspension, right? So the secretary shall suspend all payments, interest shall not accrue for the period of the suspension. However, the loan servicers have put everybody's loans into what is called an administrative forbearance. And if you've listened to me talk about student loans in the past, you will note that I do not speak highly of forbearance. This is a special exception, right? Think of everything around the pandemic as special, right? Think of this as special as well, right? This is how the loan servicers are executing. This is the tool that they have to execute the law. So they can use this administrative forbearance. This is a non-capitalizing forbearance. So the interest that accrued beforehand would not get added to your principal balance when this administrative forbearance ends. But when you log into your loan servicer account, you see that they're in forbearance, and that's got a lot of people worried, and I think that's my fault because I've been talking so poorly about forbearance for so long that everybody had a visceral negative reaction when they put their loans into forbearance, rightly so. But this is a very special case. Right. So when I go and log into my account, if I dig into the details, it says I'm in forbearance, but if I look at my loan status, it actually says Coronavirus Pandemic National Emergency Act, right? So that gives me a little bit of comfort knowing that my interest is not going to get capitalized and nothing negative is going to happen as a result of this administrative forbearance. So if you do have some private loans, there are some states that have gotten together and negotiated some benefits. It depends on what state you live in, and it depends on what lender you have for your private loans. So Forbes has got a pretty good article on the 10 states that are that have reached a deal with some of the private lenders, but you're going to have to look into that depending on the loan type that you have that's private and where you live. Right. So just like it with any private debt that anybody's trying to suspend or get some relief on, you have to log into that account and see if they're offering anything and review those details carefully. Because while some of them are offering benefits, none of them come close to what the CARES Act did. So you just have to be aware of what those options are if you need them and what the consequences might be in various scenarios. Okay, so just to review the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool, download that student aid file, upload that ugly text file into the My Student Loans tool. Which plans you can use, right? That's going to be the income-driven repayment eligibility tab. It's going to show you that in the My Student Loans, and then which plans you should use. That's where we're going to get to the loan repayment simulator, right? So once you have that summary of your borrowed data, you can send that over to the loan repayment simulator and start to run some tests, right? You're essentially running some diagnostics to see what the various quote treatment plans are for your student loans and which is going to be the best for you. So we did go through this, right? So the weighted average interest rate is it may show up as 0 if they've been removed from your file. You're going to have to estimate what that interest rate was before your suspension. Interestingly, when I was going through kind of a trial run of this earlier today, when I show you how to consolidate your loans, there is some evidence that interest rate data still exists there. So we may be able to find it by walking through the consolidation process as well. We're going to get to that in just a few here. All right, so the consolidation loan. Why do we recommend that you start the consolidation loan as soon as your loans allow after graduation, right? Because there's a lot of benefits to doing so. A consolidation loan is the only thing that allows you to end your grace period early. Otherwise, you're kind of stuck in this grace period time frame. Now, normally, that's not good because your grace period for most of your veterinary school loans, you're going to accrue interest. But because of the CARES Act, you're actually not accruing interest even during your grace period now, right? Because your grace period overlaps with this suspension period, right? So you're not accruing as much interest as you normally would on your student loans after you graduate. So, you know, that the ending that grace period for that reason alone is not really that imperative. However, getting your loans to count towards forgiveness sooner rather than later is extremely helpful, right? So the sooner you can start that clock, the sooner you're going to hit forgiveness and the less you're going to pay in total towards your loans if you're going to hit forgiveness. So it also allows you to reduce the number of loans you have. Many of you have a lot of student loans. If I come back to the our Tufts example, this person has 16 different loans, right? That can be enough to drive somebody crazy trying to manage all that, right? And it really doesn't change anything a whole lot, but when you look at it, it just looks a lot more confusing too. So consolidating this can make this a lot easier to manage, and you're not going to pay any more or any less in interest than you would if you leave it unconsolidated, right? So I would recommend that you consolidate, especially if you have a lot of different loan types. If you have health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students, those older FEL program loans, Perkins loans, this is the time to take them and put them all into that direct consolidation loan and make them eligible for income-driven repayment. And if you're working towards public service loan forgiveness, that also makes them eligible. Consolidation also allows you to choose your loan servicer, right? And this is the only opportunity that you have to do that, right? And this is, and if you've heard me talk about this before, this is kind of a crude illustration of what I call the loan servicer spectrum of terrible, right? So they range the gamut, right? None of them are good, right? They're all terrible, but some of them are less terrible than others, right? So Fed loan servicing is the least of the terribles. Great Lakes, probably the next least terrible, but Nelnet, Navient, be careful, right? They're not very helpful. They're usually quite combative. They make lots of mistakes. They all make mistakes, but they tend to make mistakes and say some of the more outrageous things that we have to debunk. So here's your opportunity to choose a different one. So the loan consolidation application actually allows you to choose a different loan servicer. You can choose Fed loan servicing. If you're working towards public service loan forgiveness, they're going to move your loans over to Fed loan servicing anyway, right? So this is why we recommend Fed loan servicing. You want to reduce the amount of time that your loans get moved around. Plus, you have to know how to administer income-driven repayment in order to monitor public service loan forgiveness. So just by virtue of that, Fed loan servicing tends to know a little bit more about income-driven repayment than the other loan servicers. What are the cons of consolidating? It is a little bit of work, right? You have to go through the electronic application process. Once you submit it, you have to wait about 30 days and they send you something in the mail that says, hey, if we got any of this wrong, please let us know. If not, we're going to go through and do it, right? So you kind of have to just monitor that. And if you're moving to a different location, you have to make sure that your address and where they can reach you is updated so you can get that confirmation of the consolidation. If you do consolidate Perkins, health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students, they have a 0 interest rate grace period and a longer grace period. You would lose that, right? But you also have the CARES Act suspension and you also get to start the forgiveness clock. That outweighs leaving them outside the consolidation, in my opinion, right? So we have tried to early on, tried to get really cute with leaving these loans out of consolidations and trying to add them later or not add them at all. And in reality, it creates logistical nightmares and you usually just end up paying more than you would have if you consolidated them early on. So if you want to keep things as simple as possible, include them in your consolidation as soon as you can after graduation. When you consolidate, you do lose the option to target certain loan types, right? So some people, and I saw this in some of your question submissions, you want to snowball or avalanche or whatever your student loans. If you consolidate them, you can't do that any longer because they replace all of your loans with one loan, right? So you can't really avalanche or snowball a single loan, right? So, but in my opinion, those snowballs and avalanche things are really not very good strategies for handling student loans anyway. So really not worth keeping your loans unconsolidated just to do something like that. The earlier you can start, the better, right? So how do you start this? As soon as your vet school loans allow, and that's indicated by when your grace period starts. So that happens after your official graduation date, right? And that's why we had to put graduate officially in this year, because many of you have been done with clinics for a while, but that does not mean you officially graduated in the eyes of the Department of Education, right? So when your loans enter their grace period is triggered based on when the school, or when your school tells the Department of Education you're set to graduate. And that's usually your commencement date, right? So I saw this in the debt and income signalment. I saw a lot of you indicate that you graduated in April or early May. And then if I go and I'll use Tufts as an example. A lot of you that submitted information from Tufts said you graduated at the end of April, 4/29. When I Google your commencement date for 2020, it says 5/17, right? So that's when your loans are going to officially be reflected as graduated. And that's when you'll enter your grace period, right? So sometimes your loans will immediately, like the day after your graduation, they'll be in the grace period. Sometimes you might have to wait until the end of the month for that to get triggered. But your loans won't officially enter that grace period until after you've at least passed your commencement date. So you're not going to be able to start this consolidation loan if you haven't passed that commencement date yet, right? Your loans are still in an in-school status, and you're not allowed to consolidate loans while you're in school. Right? So you really have to look for that grace period status. We will show you that in the My Student Loans tool, right? So you can see here that this person's got most of their loans, particularly from vet school, are still in this in-school status. Right? And as soon as that gets updated to grace period, when you upload that file in here, it'll actually say in grace, right? That's when you can start the consolidation process. All right, we've already gone through those. It can take 30 to 60 days for this to process. And again, you want to make sure that you have some semblance of an address that, you know, somebody, if you're not going to be there to get this paperwork, somebody you trust is going to get it and tell you that they've gotten it, right? So you want to know when that paperwork arrives so you can confirm that or correct any mistakes that were made. You are going to be a little bit of a test case, right? You're going to be a test case for a lot of stuff, graduating in this kind of pandemic environment. I don't believe that COVID-19 should impact any of this switching from in school to in grace period. It's hard for me to imagine why that would, but there have been some bizarro things happen in the last 2 months, right? So just monitor that closely. If your loans are really stubborn and they don't show a grace period, it's worth a phone call to either your school financial aid office or maybe even your dean's office to see if they've, you know, submitted your graduation information to the Department of Education so that can be reflected. And then you may have to go to the Department of Education next if it's still stuck in that grace period. But if you get to, you know, if you graduate in May and your loans are not in the grace period by June 1st, then that's when I would start making some phone calls. All right, so when I'm consolidating my student loans, I'm going to have the option of picking a repayment plan. Actually, before we do that, let's come over here and go through that. Let's actually go through an example of what consolidation looks like. So I can do this again from the studentaid.gov, and I can take you guys so far. I don't want to reconsolidate my loans because that would start my clock over again, right? So, but I can take you as far as I can go and be comfortable that I'm not going to trigger a consolidation of my current loans. But you're under this Manage Loans tab after you log in. You can see here, consolidate my loans. I'm going to blow this up a little bit. All right, so here you can do this electronically, right? So, or if you want, you can read the paper version, but you can start this whole process electronically. It's going to pull in all of the loans that already exist in your system. Mostly the ones from that student aid file are going to get pulled in here automatically, right? You can add additional loans, right? So this is where you can add something like a health profession student loan, right? So it's probably not going to pull in those health profession student loans automatically. I think it's Q. Yeah. So down here at health profession student loans, you can add that manually, right? Same with your Perkins loans. Federal Perkins loans are here if they're not automatically pulled in. Loans for disadvantaged students, that's the Z loan type, right? So you can add these manually, right? You're gonna have to know the loan servicer, right? So it might be your school, it might be another one, right? It might be one of the other ones that they contract with. The account number when you receive them, the interest rates on health professional student loans are always 5%, right? So you're gonna have to collect some of that information in order to have this added to your consolidation. All right, so we're gonna come down here to the grace period. This is how you end your grace period early, right? So processing delay. You can consolidate your loans, and if you still have an existing grace period for those loans, you can let that grace period run its course, right? But you don't want to let the grace period run its course because then you're not officially in repayment yet, right? So this is how you end the grace period early. You select this do not delay processing, right? So as soon as this consolidation completes, right, 30 to 60 days, they'll generate a statement and you'll have to start paying on your student loans. Right, but we're going to talk about how you're going to get a $0 payment for the first 12 months. This is where you can select your servicer, right? So this loan servicer selection, how do I select Fed loan servicing? There's a second one in this list, Fed loan servicing FIA, right? This is the loan servicer that you want to choose. If you already have Fed loan servicing, then you can choose them again and it'll just keep your loans there. All right, so this is the, I think I could go one more step here. So once I selected all those, and then this is going to be where you can select your repayment option. So if you consolidate your loans, you choose the end the grace period early, they're going to ask you what repayment plan do you want to use for your new direct consolidation loan. And this is where you're going to select your repayment plan, right? And this is why the next section we're going to go through is so important, right? You're going to want to have done this legwork ahead of time to identify the plan that's going to work best for you and choose it, right? There's an option in some of the income-driven repayment paperwork to let the loan servicer pick the plan, and you never want to do that, right? I would never trust them to pick a plan for me, right? So you have to do the homework here to choose the plan that's best for you and select it from this list. All right, so that's as far as I can go without signing something that would start my consolidation loan again. I don't want to do that. But you can consolidate an already consolidated loan. So just because you had a previously consolidated loan, you can include your vet school loans and consolidate an old consolidation loan again. Okay, how are we doing? All right. I see a question here about some of the other loan servicers, OSLA. So the ones that I mentioned in that spectrum of terrible, those are the 4 biggies. There are about 11 or maybe 13 loan servicers, and I just don't know enough information about the other ones. If you want to keep one that you had through school, that's fine, right? But again, I would really recommend that you move them over to Fed loan servicing on the off chance that you end up working towards public service loan forgiveness, because your loans are going to get moved anyway, right? And if you're already in repayment and your loans get moved again, it's just another chance for them to screw something up, right? So I would recommend picking Fed loan servicing just because then you know it's not going to move again.
A few people are asking, is there any reason not to consolidate?
Yeah, I can't really think of a very good reason, right? I mean, you could probably, if we analyzed it to death, in light of the COVID-19 stuff, if you had a very low student debt balance, it probably doesn't matter too much, right? So if your debt to income ratio is 0.5 or lower, it's probably not worth all the effort to consolidate, right? Because if you're starting a job or your income hasn't really been impacted, you can probably make some payments during this suspension period and you're going to pay your loans off pretty quickly, right? Without having to, sacrifice any significant percentage of your income. But if it's anything higher than that, then I can't really think of a good reason not to consolidate, get that minimum payment to 0 for the first 12 months and start the rest of your financial plan.
And one more question, will consolidation impact your credit?
Will consolidation impact your credit score?
Correct.
No. And if anything, it's going to make things easier in the long run, right? Because your credit score is really, as a student, with no payment and an in-school status, is sort of negatively impacted already, right? So the sooner you can get into repayment, the better you're going to be. Now, there's an exception when you have a $0 payment, but we can talk about that as a separate case. But consolidation by itself is not going to hurt your credit. If anything, it's going to get you started in repayment officially, which is only going to hurt or help your credit long term.
Okay, one more question, which is, if all my loans are already with the same provider, is it worth consolidating?
Yes. If all of your loans are still with the same provider, and maybe they're even still with Fed Loan Servicing, you want to consolidate the loans because that's the only way to get them out of the grace period, right? Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in that grace period and you're not going to get any credit towards the time you spend in repayment, right? So as soon as you can get that consolidation loan processed and you're officially in repayment, the clock towards forgiveness starts ticking, right? The forgiveness clock will not start ticking while you're in your grace period, right? Even if you chose to make payments for some reason, right? So the only way to get that clock ticking is to consolidate that loan and actually get it into one of the income-driven repayment plans. Plus, when this suspension period ends and you're officially in repayment, then you can get an auto pay discount, right? So you can just start the auto pay discount when you're in repayment, but you can't get the auto pay discount while you're in your grace period. So there's a couple of little benefits to doing so as well.
So I just have to share this one so that you can clearly answer this. If I was told by someone at my financial advisor and teacher at school that if I consolidate and get my interest rate to zero, that I will go to jail. Is there any risk of this?
That's a new one.
I thought
No, you're not going to jail. I mean, you're if anything, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you're following the law, right? I mean, the CARES Act, they were going to put your interest rate to zero, and they've already done that, right? Your interest rate is already zero, right? My interest rate is zero right now. Nobody's going to jail for having a zero interest rate. That's interesting. I would love to know who's saying that, and if they were serious or just joking, because that's ridiculous. So, no, you will not go to jail if you consolidate your loans, and it is not illegal to have a 0% interest rate, right? And that's what the CARES Act is stipulating. Okay, so repayment plans. Income-driven repayment versus time-driven repayment, right? There's two basic types of, two repayment concepts, if you will, right? So everybody's familiar with time-driven repayment. That's essentially a traditional repayment structure. This is every mortgage, car loan, credit card. I mean, all of them are based on a principal, interest, and the amount of time that you are paying that loan back. So income-driven repayment is very different, right? So the payments are based on your income, and we'll talk about how that distorts things in just a second. But a time-driven repayment plan, you know, at its core is the principal, the interest rate, and the amount of time that you choose to pay back your student loan is what determines the monthly payment, right? And it doesn't really care if you can afford that monthly payment or not. It's strictly a function of what you borrowed and the interest rate, right? So those can be very well defined, right? And people like that, like they like knowing what my monthly payment is going to be, and I know what I'm going to pay, and I know that I'm going to hit a zero balance at a specified period of time as long as I can satisfy all of those payments, right? So there are definitely, there's definitely good reasons to use those types of strategies. Income-driven repayment, so income-based repayment, pay-as-you-earn, revised pay-as-you-earn, those are the most popular. So they have eligibility requirements. There are various differences among them, and we're going to go through some of those. The monthly payment can change as your income changes, right? So the monthly payment goes up when your income goes up, right? If your income goes down, your monthly payment goes down, right? So this creates a variable cost structure that drives people crazy, right? So it is harder to project what it's going to cost you using an income-driven repayment plan. And if you're in them long enough, you may hit forgiveness, right? So that tends to make them extremely complex, very confusing, and then most people throw it out the window when they get to that point, right? But what we can see in these income-driven repayment plans, particularly when we see the types of debt-to-income ratios that veterinarians have, is that they can actually be financially beneficial if you understand how to navigate them. So this is where the My Student Loans and the Loan Repayment Simulator come in, right? So if you upload the file in the My Student Loans, you get that summary, and then you can send that information over to the Loan Repayment Simulator. Before we get to the Loan Repayment Simulator, we have to call this out, right? Because this is probably one of the most common myths of student loan repayment. And that is, if I can just get out and refinance my student loans at a lower interest rate, I will lower my monthly payment and I'll pay less in total. And that is just not true, right? It might be true in very specific cases, in very low debt to income ratio situations. But if your debt to income ratio is pretty much anywhere above 1, refinancing your student loans are not going to necessarily result in a lower monthly payment or a lower total cost. And we can illustrate that, right, just using any number of the 1,000 traditional loan repayment calculators out on the interwebs, right? So I like bankrate.com. They've got a lot of good information on here. So let's come back over to, let's use this one as an example. Let's say we've got $196,000 of student loans. And this is where I asked you all to define for me what a reasonable amount of time is to pay back your student loans. And I saw a lot of single digit numbers, right? 5 years, 7 years, right? Let's see what that looks like. What will it take to pay back $196,000 in 5 years? And let's say I'm able to refinance that at what? I don't know. Let's just say 3%. So essentially, in this case, we're cutting the interest rate in half, right? You would have to pay $3,500 a month for 5 years to make that happen, right? That is going to be extremely difficult given the average salary that you all told me that you're going to be earning when you start your jobs in very shortly, right? So for some of you, this is going to be more or about what you're taking home after taxes, right? So this is not a very realistic repayment strategy, right? So lowering the interest rate, cutting the term length is really not necessarily a good way to think about paying back your student loans. So you're really, even if you could afford this, you're really crossing your fingers and hoping nothing adversely happens in the next 5 years to your income or interrupts this. And you're essentially postponing your financial future for at least 5 years, plus all the damage that you're doing long-term by not doing all of the things that you should be doing to plan for a good long-term financial wellness plan. So let's extend this out a little bit farther, right? Let's do 10 years, right? Maybe you're still able to get that beneficial interest rate, right? $1,900 a month. Better, but still really, really difficult to maintain. And now, put a pin in this, right? So 10 years, $1,900 a month. Let's use that to compare against what an income-driven repayment plan requires you to pay based on your income, right? So the gist here is that, there's plenty of calculators out here. If you have a goal of paying your loans back quickly, test it, right? Put the amount that you have in student debt in here, put whatever you think your reasonable number of years to pay back your student loans are in here, whatever interest rate you think you can get, and see what it comes out to, right? See if that's a monthly payment that either has your eyes bugging out of your head or you're shrugging your shoulders and like, I can make that work, right? So, but you have to test it, right? Just simply saying that you want to do it isn't going to be good enough. All right, so what do the income-driven plans look like, right? So here are the different, here are some of the different features, right? So these are the ones that are largely baked into the VIN Foundation Student Loan Repayment Simulator. I don't expect you to memorize this. I just want you to know that the different plans have different features, right? And when you narrow down which plan that you think you want to use, that's when you want to start understanding those different features a little bit more. So let's first just kind of look at how they work. So they calculate the payment as a function of your discretionary income, right? So discretionary income has a very specific meaning in the Department of Education, right? So what is discretionary income? Your discretionary income is your taxable income less 150% of the federal poverty guidelines, right? So there's a very simple equation. The federal poverty guidelines are published and they're updated every year on this website. You can look them up. But essentially, they're going to take your taxable income, they're going to subtract off an allowance, and that's what your discretionary income is. So they're essentially normalizing your income. So let's say, let's just do a test, right? Let's do a really best case scenario here, right? $100,000 starting income for a 2020 graduating practicing veterinarian, right? That's above the average that you all reported to me, but let's just play, the opposite of devil's advocate here. So if I do this equation, 12,760, that's the federal poverty guidelines for a family size of 1 in the lower 48 states. So I multiply that by 1.5 and I subtract that from my $100,000 taxable income, and I get a discretionary income of 80,000, roughly 81,000. If I multiply that by 10% and divide it by 12 to get monthly payments, my income, right, my $100,000 income requires me to pay $674 a month towards my student loans, right? So $674 a month. So when anybody asks, which is the best repayment plan, or how do I know if I should do a standard 10-year as fast as possible or use one of the income-driven repayment plans, the first question you need to ask is how much does your income require you to pay, right? Do that calculation, figure out what that number is, and then compare that against what you wanted to pay under your alternative strategy, right? So that one that we were working up in the loan and the bank rate calculator, right, was $1,800 a month, or almost $1,900 a month for a 10-year plan, right? 3 times as much, right? You can give yourself quite a break by paying what your income requires, right? But what's missing from this calculation, right? And this is really the rub with the income-driven repayment plans, right? There is no debt balance in this equation, right? What income-driven repayment has done is completely disconnected student loan repayment from the loan balance itself, right? So whether you have $100,000 of student debt in this case, or you have $500,000 of student debt, the payment is still the same, right? Now, there are going to be very different side effects in those two different extremes, right? If you have $100,000 of student loans and you're paying $674 a month, that'll probably cover the interest and maybe hit some of the principal. If you've got $500,000 of student loans, $674 a month is not going to come close to it, right? So you're going to have unpaid interest. You're going to have a balance that grows and you're going to hit forgiveness, right? But once you know that and you know how it works, then we can start doing the next set of tests, which is figuring out how do I navigate forgiveness and covering any tax that might be part of that. All right, so how much did you tell me that you were expecting to pay on your federal student loans after you graduate? Right, so the range was anywhere between $0 a month and $8,000 a month. That's going to be tough, but noble goal, right? The average was about $1,060 per month that you expected to pay towards your student loans, right? So more than half of you indicated that you expected to pay more towards your student loans than $100,000 income actually requires, right? So you can give yourself a significant break, particularly in these early years that you're just getting up to speed. You've got a lot of uncertainty, right? It's hard enough being a new graduate and learning how to be a veterinarian as it is without all of the pandemic stuff going on. But we just don't know what the next year or two are going to look like, right? So I would really encourage you to give yourself a break before you try to embark on a really aggressive student loan repayment strategy that has you throwing more income than you need to towards your student loans. So what did you anticipate earning, or what do you anticipate earning? This is just kind of a quick breakout of by some various types. So interns, residents, 39,000. Those of you that indicated that you're not doing an internship or residency across all of those private practice types, the average was about 86,000. For companion animal exclusive was 90,000, right? Mixed animal, got somebody in there that is is earning $500,000 a year as a new grad mixed animal practitioner. Congratulations. It would be great if you would let us all know where that opportunity exists, and we can all learn from that. Might be inflating my average just a smidge there, but I didn't get a chance to clean up that data to that level. So, but we do see, I think that this 90,000 in the companion animal realm was kind of what the average was last year, right? So I expected that to be higher again before COVID happened, but I am still kind of pleasantly surprised to see that it's at least holding at the level that it was. So that's good, right? So, but again, the example that I used before was with $100,000 income, right? So with a lower income, your minimum monthly payment on your student loans will be lower, right? And it can be even lower than the 674. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about the other elephant in the room here, which is forgiveness, right? Forgiveness, and particularly in this case, let's differentiate the taxable version of forgiveness from public service loan forgiveness, right? So public service loan forgiveness is kind of the holy grail of student loan repayment, right? It requires you to have the right loan types, right? So that, again, why it's so important to go through that exercise of inventorying your loans. Another reason why it might be a good idea to consolidate, right? So if you have loans that are not direct loans and you want to make them qualify for something like public service loan forgiveness or pay as you earn or revised pay as you earn, then you have to consolidate them, right? That's how you get them to have direct in the name. Public service loan forgiveness is not a repayment plan, right? So you use one of the income-driven repayment plans in order to satisfy the requirements to earn public service loan forgiveness, right? And even zero amounts qualify. So if you get a $0 payment for the first 12 months you're in repayment, those 12 months will qualify towards public service loan forgiveness or the taxable version of forgiveness under an income-driven plan. You do have to be working in the right job or combination of jobs. So that's a state, federal, local 501c3 organization. And you have to be averaging at least 30 hours per week with that employer. Your goal when you're working towards public service loan forgiveness is to maximize the amount forgiven. So what does that mean? It means you want to pay as little as possible towards your student loans, right? So there are ways to decrease the amount that you pay, and a lot of them have to do with taking advantage of pre-tax benefits that you might have from those employers, and maybe even filing your taxes separately, right? So if you have a spouse that doesn't have student loans and you don't want their income to contribute towards the monthly payment, then you can file your taxes separately and have the payment based only on your income, right? So that would lower your monthly payment significantly and increase the amount that is forgiven under public service loan forgiveness, right? So, but you do have to compare the tax benefits that you might give up versus the savings you're going to get in your monthly student loan payment. But those are just examples of how you can maximize the amount that's forgiven. You can't enroll in public service loan forgiveness. I see a lot of people indicate that they want to use public service loan forgiveness as a repayment plan, right? But it's not, right? You have to use one of the income-driven plans, which is why you have to know enough about this, particularly if you're going to be working towards public service loan forgiveness, right? So many of you, if you're going to stay in academia or head back to academia, or if you're going to work at a shelter, a zoo, aquariums, be a state veterinarian, a federal veterinarian, right? All of those are positions that will be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. We had a VBMA event with UC Davis this afternoon, a news brief, and a lot of the veterinarians on the panel were talking about how important veterinarians will need to be in public health going forward. I hope that's the case, right? But public health positions are generally public service loan forgiveness qualifying positions, right? So if that's kind of where your career is heading, a lot of you are doing Masters of Public Health alongside your DVM or maybe slightly after. I mean, hopefully these are things that are going to lead you to a position because that's where your passion lies, but it also might help you qualify for public service loan forgiveness. So some of you may have seen the news around public service loan forgiveness. I looked this up 2 days ago, and 145,000 borrowers have applied. As of March 2020, so far 3,100 borrowers have been granted public service loan forgiveness. Believe it or not, that is a marked improvement. In the earliest application cycle, we had less than 1% of folks qualifying for public service loan forgiveness, and now we're above 2%, right? So we are going to steadily see that proportion increase There were a lot of reasons why public service loan forgiveness didn't go well the first few years here, and most of them were because federal direct loans were not the predominant loan type at that time when this started, and we only had one pretty terrible income-driven repayment plan, and nobody was using it, right? So they were not meeting the requirements of public service loan forgiveness. So when you see, reports that says that the government's not honoring public service loan forgiveness, so why should I, count on income-driven repayment? It's not that they're not honoring it. It's that it was set up in such a way that it was very difficult for those early folks to even be eligible for it. That has since corrected. Unfortunately, we can't go back in time and fix it for those folks because they just weren't doing the right things. But the people that were denied because they didn't meet the requirements. Right? Now that might not have been their fault, but that's the reason, right? And so the sooner that you know what the requirements are and you start yourself off on the right path, you won't have to worry about being subject to those same pitfalls. All right, so the best repayment plan. So what is the best repayment plan? So I define the best repayment plan. This is student loans now, right? So student loans are very different from other types of debt, right? You can't throw federal student loans in the same bucket as all other types of debt because they're just not, right? So but the best repayment plan for student loans reduces the risk to you and your family, maximizes your cash flow, and minimizes your total repayment costs, right? And if you can get all three of those things to happen, then ding, 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 right? You found a winner. So what does your income require you to pay versus another plan or strategy? That is a fairly simple exercise to go through. So that equation is pretty simple. You can use the student loan repayment simulator to put your income in and see what the minimum monthly payment is going to be, and then compare that against what your other plan or strategy is, right? If there's a significant difference in the monthly payment, right, then you want to take advantage of the one that gives you the lowest monthly payment. That's what it means to maximize your cash flow. Right now, then you're going to have to run the simulation out to see what is the total cost of this repayment strategy, and is there a big difference, right? And if there might be a big difference in certain cases, there also might be a big difference in timeframes. Right? So you're going to have to note that as well, right? You might save a lot more money paying your student loans over 5 years, but you're putting yourself and your family at risk because of the risk to your cash flow and also postponing all of your other financial plans, right? So just because you get the absolute lowest total repayment cost in the shortest period of time is not necessarily the goal, right? Because you're going to have to sacrifice too many other things in order to obtain that goal. All right, so quick test. I mean, again, you can do this, and we'll use the loan repayment simulator to illustrate this. But if you, we haven't mentioned this, I meant to ask about this in a poll question, actually, I completely forgot. But if you have already filed a tax return, either in 2018 or 2019, and presuming that that tax return is low, right, or maybe even zero, you can use that as documentation of your income to get into your income-driven repayment plan, and you'll have a $0 payment for the first 12 months, right? So you can pay zero for the first 12 months. And because of how the application is set up, when you file your tax return for 2020, right? So by April 15th of 2021, you'll have maybe at best a half a year's worth of income on there, right? So you all indicated that your income is going to be somewhere between $85,000 and maybe $90,000. Half a year's worth of that income is going to be on your tax return for 2020, right? So that means your following 12 months of payments will be based on $40,000, $45,000, right? That's still going to be a very low number, right? So those 24 months will net you a significant amount of money to help you jumpstart your repayment or your financial plans, right? So building an emergency fund, paying down credit card debt or private loans, saving for a home, saving for a practice, all of these things that you tell me that you want to do and achieve in a relatively short amount of time after graduation. This is how you can free up the cash flow to do it. And if you're going to hit forgiveness, you get credit towards forgiveness even with that $0 payment. So compare that against the 24 months of paying some other amount, right? And see how much money that you net in your favor that you can use in other more beneficial ways. We can use, and after running thousands and thousands of these simulations for our veterinary colleagues, some themes emerge, right? So debt to income ratio is the biggest theme. So the student debt to income ratio, if you take your student debt and you divide it by your income, you will get a student debt to income ratio. And when your debt to income ratio is less than 1, you're going to pay your loans off before you hit forgiveness. And it's not going to take a significant chunk of your income to do it. Right? You can choose to use income-driven repayment in the early years if you want, particularly during this period of uncertainty. If you wanted to have that $0 payment for the first 12 months and maybe something smaller for the 12 months after that, and then as your budget becomes a little bit more clear, you can choose to pay more if you want to, perfectly fine, right? You might even do a private refi if your debt to income ratio is less than 1 and you're reasonably certain your income is going to stay there for the duration of repayment. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Again, it's just too risky for me, but that's when the private refi is more of a viable option. When your debt to income ratio is greater than 1, right? So your student debt balance exceeds your income. Start the consolidation loan like we talked about. Choose the most beneficial income-driven repayment plan for your situation. Pay the minimum. If you can, start planning for the forgiveness. Right now, if you're doing an internship or something, you're not going to be able to start planning for the forgiveness, but that's okay, right? You're going to get through that internship, maybe a residency after that, and once your income increases, then you can calculate how much it's going to require to save for forgiveness, right? But that's the strategy, is to pay the minimum, plan for the forgiveness, and as your situation changes, if your income increases appreciably, your payment will increase as well. Right? If that determines you should change gears, then change gears at that time. What you want to avoid doing is trying to pay above your income, if you will. Right? If you come out of the gate, guns blazing, trying to pay down your student loans as fast as possible and you don't have the income to support it, you're inevitably sacrificing other areas of your financial plan. And if that doesn't go well, you've just thrown a whole bunch of money towards your student loans that you didn't have to. Right? So pace yourself, right? This is a marathon. This is not a sprint.
Tony, I just want to interject. A couple people are asking, what if their salary changes over time? For instance, what if their ratio, changes based on a new job, et cetera?
Yeah, so it will change, right? So your debt to income ratio will change over time, right? And it depends on what it changes to and when that change happens. Right? And that's where the loan repayment simulator is going to come in, right? And we'll illustrate that with the loan repayment simulator, but let your income determine that, right? There's nothing wrong with making payments based on your income for the duration of repayment. If that happens to pay your loans to zero, congratulations, right? If it happens to not pay your loans to zero, you can hit forgiveness, congratulations, right? Just be prepared for the taxes. Either way, you're going to be done with student loan repayment, right? But you'll have more money available to pursue other opportunities if you keep your payment a manageable percentage of your income, right? So, and that's really, this is why we use this debt to income ratio. And the higher your debt to income ratio, the more financially beneficial income driven repayment is on paper, right? But the higher your debt to income ratio, the harder it is to save for that tax on forgiveness too, right? Because the higher your debt to income ratio, the more you're probably going to have forgiven. So, it becomes difficult to save enough to have on hand for that forgiveness, right? But it's still the most beneficial way to pay. The lower your debt to income ratio, the more closely income driven repayment and a standard 10-year plan, they essentially converge. Right? And that's really where the debt to income ratio 1 comes from, because the debt to income ratio of 1 is generally about where you pay 10% of your income to pay back a balance using a standard 10-year plan, right? So 10% of your income at a debt to income ratio of 1 will generate a payment that will roughly pay that balance off in 10 years or less. right? So it kind of, the income-driven plans and at least the current structure of them are trying to get to a point where it mimics how you pay a standard 10-year. It just doesn't necessarily pay the balance to zero if your debt to income ratio is greater than 1, right? But it doesn't require you to pay anything more. So here, I mean, you can think about it this way too, right? So what does your taxable income need to be in order for a pay-as-you-earn, a revised pay-as-you-earn monthly payment to equal a standard 10-year monthly payment, right? So let's come over to the loan repayment simulator, and we'll use, we can use this one. Let's use the $196,000 one because we know the interest rate here. So I'm going to send this over to the loan repayment simulator. All right, and I'm going to knock off, I'm going to put my auto pay discount on here. All right, and so we got a roughly $200,000 balance. Let's first, I'm going to run it with, let's say this person is going into companion animal medicine. You can choose to increase this income how you see fit, right? You can use the 3.5% straight line increase that we have here as a default, but that's probably not reality, right? But it gets you to an approximation to see how this stuff works. But you can go in here and change these numbers to match whatever your reality is. We'll leave spouses out of this equation, but if you are married, your spouse has student debts, this is where you're going to enter all that stuff, right? You can change their income over time as well. If they have federal student loans, you'll want to enter that balance in, how you file your taxes, right? That'll determine whether or not we include your spouse's income in that simulation. Children factor into the discretionary income calculation, right? The more dependents you have, the bigger the allowance essentially you receive, right? So if children that you have now or dependents that you have now and the children in the future that you might have will all impact your student loan repayment strategy. So let's go ahead and run this, right? And here I just want to illustrate what a standard 10-year monthly payment would be, right? $21.56 versus pay-as-you-earn, generally one of the more beneficial plans, $590, right? Significantly less than trying to pay your loans off as fast as possible, which means you have $1,500 more in your budget to work with. Right now, if I go down a little bit farther, I'm going to see that this is going to end up in forgiveness, right? I'm going to have an amount forgiven that's actually higher than the balance that I started with, right? And that's because I never actually hit the principal, right? All of my payments went towards interest for the entire 20 years, and I even had a little bit more forgiven, right? So when it gets forgiven, we have to assume a tax rate. Here we assume 30%. That means I need to come up with about $65,000 20 years from now in order to cover that tax, right? So if I come down here and look at how am I going to cover that tax, we have a forgiveness planning module that says if I take $196 a month and I average 3% return on that over the next 20 years, I will have enough on hand to cover that tax, and it actually only cost me about $47,000 to save that $65,000, right? So that lowered my total cost. In this scenario, the total projected cost under pay-as-you-earn is less than if you tried to pay it back under a standard 10-year plan, and I had all of this flexibility in my budget, right? So $590 goes to the loan servicer, $200 goes into my special account planning for forgiveness, right? So I'm up to roughly $800 total, which means I have freed up $1,300 a month to do all of those other things that are way more important than paying more than your income requires towards your student loans, right? And it ends up saving me money in the long run, right? So this is one of those occasions where it meets all three of those requirements for the best repayment plan. Maximizes my cash flow flexibility, reduces the risk to myself and my family. So what do I mean by that? When I say reduces the risk, your federal student loans are your student loans. right? They're tied to your name. If something terrible should happen to you, nobody else is responsible for them. They go away with you, right? So no, if you take your loans out of that federal system and put them into something like a private loan refinance, that's not always the case, right? And sometimes they will actually entice a spouse or a family member to be a co-signer on that loan in order to get you the lowest interest rate. In those cases, if you can't pay your student loan back for any reason, it then falls to that co-signer, right? So you have to be really careful with those private loan refinances, right? They're just not nearly as flexible or beneficial as these income-driven repayment plans. And you'll notice too, here we assumed a constant increase in your income, right? What if that doesn't happen? Right? What if we go through an event like we're going through right now? What if you graduated 3 years ago and all of a sudden you found yourself furloughed, or the practice that you're working at is closed because the public health department said that too many people have COVID-19, right? Your income might be zero for a little while, right? In that case, you can apply to have your payment reduced to zero, right? You're still considered to be current on your student loans. It'll adjust the amount that gets forgiven, right? But you haven't appreciably interrupted your budget because of your student loans, right? So this is, I mean, you can think of this as almost like an insurance plan too, right? I mean, that's the reason why I continue to keep ours, right? Because you just never know what's going to happen, right? And I like having that insurance. I like not having to pay more than whatever my income requires towards my student loans. Tip, right? So if you had filed a tax return in 2018, or you can still file a tax return for 2019. The tax filing deadline was extended to July 15th for federal tax returns, right? So you still have between now and July 15th to file a tax return for 2019. If you have a tax return on file, you can actually get a $0 payment. Why? Right? Because most likely, unless one of you had some special operation in your basement at vet school, your income is probably zero or something close to it for that 4th year of vet school. When you go to apply for your income-driven repayment plan, they're going to ask you for income documentation. If you have that tax return on file and it shows an adjusted gross income of zero, your payment will be zero for the first 12 months, right? So let's say that you officially graduate tomorrow and your loans go into the grace period Monday and you start the consolidation process, and that gets done by June 15th. And in the meantime, you filed your tax return for 2019. You can submit that as income documentation, and your payment will be zero starting in June, July, and it'll be set to zero until the following June or July, right? So now, then we can come back over here. And as we said before, you're going to start your job June. Maybe you're going to earn half a year's worth of income. So we're going to cut this in half. So this becomes about $47,000, right? And it won't be until the 3rd year that you're out that you're going to have a full tax year's worth of income, right? So I'm going to update this simulation. I'm going to rerun it with those 2 changes, right? And we're going to come back down here. And now I've just decreased my total repayment costs even further, right? I pushed more of it into forgiveness. The forgiveness amount went up, right? The amount that I have to allocate towards forgiveness only goes up by $10 a month, even though I just bought myself 12 months of $0 payments instead of the $575 payments, right? So you're freeing up significant cash flow here in order to do all of these other things that you're able to do. You can really jumpstart your financial plan in these first 2 years to get to the other goals that you're trying to reach. So when I said earlier, I said do a cost benefit analysis, right? So I'm going to pull up a calculator here. In the first 24 months, if I undertake this standard 10-year plan and I pay $21.56 times 24, that's $52,000 out of my pocket. If I take this approach that we just illustrated, I'm going to pay zero for the first 12 months. And then I need to come back down here and look what my payment's going to be for the second 12 months. $229 a month. So I'm going to pay $229 for 12 months over 2 years versus the 51,744, $50,000. That's 50 in 2 years. You've netted yourself nearly $50,000. That's an emergency fund. That's maxing out retirement funds. That's putting a down payment on a house. That's preparing you for the opportunity to buy a practice, right? And that can happen relatively quickly. And it didn't cost me anything more on my student loans. It actually saved me money, right? So it's bizarre, it's counterintuitive, right? But run your situations through here. And that was kind of a middle of the road situation, right? I picked this one because this was the average of the student debt, actually a little below the average of the student debt that you all submitted to me, right? It was around 202,000 was the average. So for those of you that have higher student debt totals, this is going to be even more beneficial, right? But the amount that's forgiven gets higher. The amount that you have to allocate towards forgiveness gets higher. Then we start running into some difficulties in terms of trying to plan for that forgiveness. That's sometimes when we see pay as you earn be a little more beneficial. So run your situations through here, start using the simulator, pushing some buttons, changing some numbers, varying the scenarios based on your circumstances, and you'll see winners bubble to the surface, right? I mean, there's really no scenario here where this standard 10-year is a winner, right? I mean, could you do it? Probably, right? But that means you're essentially postponing your life for a significant amount of time because you're not going to be able to contribute to all those other areas of your financial plan while maintaining this kind of payment. Oh, we didn't even answer this question. So what in this scenario, what does my income need to be in order for my pay-as-you-earn monthly payment to approach 2156? Right? Think about what that might be in your head. But it is likely somewhere around 200, maybe 245. Let's see what that does. 18, so it's not quite yet, right? So let's try 265. Right? I think you're starting to get the idea here though, right? Other than the one person that indicated that they were going to earn $500,000 a year as a mixed animal practitioner, your income has to get pretty damn high before you start reaching the level of what a standard 10-year payment requires you to pay, right? And this is why we see income-driven repayment be really beneficial for the majority of veterinarians who have student debt, right? Is because we just don't see these kind of incomes, not only in the first couple of years, but not usually unless or until you are in a lucrative specialty or a very successful practice owner, right? Maybe some of the emergency people in the urban areas are earning some of those things if they have some additional responsibilities as well, or they're a super producer, right? But those are some pretty rare scenarios, right? So, and you know what? When you're earning this amount, you can do whatever you want with your student loans because congratulations, right? Your cash flow is really not impeding your ability to pay a standard 10-year amount towards your student loans, right? But don't try to do it before your income gets to that point. All right. So here's some questions that you all submitted that I wanted to just address specifically, right? So I think we've covered the, my student debt is approximately 150. Should I consider using an income-driven repayment plan? Yeah. If you're, unless your income is above 150, then absolutely you should be starting with an income-driven repayment plan, right? If nothing else, just to give you that cash flow buffer for the first couple of years, so you can start building all of those other areas of your financial plan. If you want to buy a practice shortly after graduation, I think this is probably the best way to do it, right? Because you're going to need cash to put towards that practice purchase, or at least have some cash on hand to be in a better position to finance a practice purchase when you can find that practice that's going to be a good candidate for you, right? That's how you can free up that cash flow. You don't have to have your student debt balance zero before you buy a practice. You can buy a practice even with $400,000 of student debt if you wanted to, right? As long as the practice cash flows and as long as your personal finances and your credit history and your business plan indicate that it should, then you can still obtain financing for that practice, right? But it helps you if you have some cash on hand to bring to the table when that opportunity arises. If you have both federal and private student loans. So this is another reason why it's imperative that you get those federal loans consolidated, get the $0 payment for the first 12 months, get that partial, half years of income payment for the next 12 months, and try to pay down those private student loans, try to pay down credit card debt. All of those other less flexible debts that you have that don't have this ability to pay based on your income and have that backstop of forgiveness, you want to pay those less flexible debts off first, right? You can do that by minimizing the payment that's due to your federal student loans. Some of you indicated that you wanted to work and live, or maybe are already working and living outside the US, but you have US student loans. I would really encourage you to get on VIN and search through the VIN student debt folder, right? So that's where we do private consultations. You can even post anonymously in there, but that has been one that's come up quite frequently. And everybody seems to get stumbled by the exchange rate and how they should pay back their student loans. In reality, you don't even have to worry about it. This is one of those instances. It's really weird, right? I mean, I didn't make these rules, so don't kill me. But this is how this works. When you live and work in a country that has favorable tax treatment, like let's say you live and work in Canada, Australia, or the UK or something, you may not earn as much as you would earn here, but you pay almost zero US taxes, right? Until you earn above a certain level, somewhere above something like $130,000 or $140,000. You don't have to pay any taxes, right? So you can come down here and actually set your simulation income to zero, right? And as long as you lived and worked in that environment, you would not have to make a payment on your student loans. You would still be considered to be current on your student loans. But let's watch what happens when you run that out, right? You have a pretty big amount forgiven, right? $442,000, right? You're still going to have to figure out how you're going to come up with that tax bill, right? Because you're not going to be able to escape that tax bill, even if you're not living in the US when that loan is forgiven. So essentially, your forgiveness plan becomes your student loan payment. But even in this case, that's still reasonable, right? $300, $400 a month US if you're living outside the US, right? To prepare yourself for the eventual tax. So yes, I mean, this is kind of an anomaly, right? And it probably wasn't meant to work this way, but your payment is driven off of your US tax return, right? So if you use that, this is what it would look like. So it's just the, can you stomach watching this loan balance grow, right? I mean, that loan balance is going to grow over that 20 years, and you're going to have to come up with that tax at the end. All right, so private versus federal refinancing for 5 to 7 year repayment. Again, I think we showed you how you can do that. So that's pretty easy math. So you just have to pick a calculator, put your loan balance in there, see what kind of interest rates you can get. And if you can, justify the monthly payment for that period of time, and you want to take that risk, go for it, right? I would never recommend it. I mean, it's just not, I would rather keep the insurance and the income driven plans and pay more aggressively there in case I need to step back for any reason. But I'm just not willing to give up that flexibility that I have. All right, so when can a private refi work, right? So if you have private student loans that have some pretty crappy interest rates, right? Now is a great time to refinance them. But you're gonna have a really hard time refinancing any loans as a new graduate, right? You're probably gonna have to get out there, document some income, show some improvement in your credit score before you're gonna qualify for some of these really beneficial interest rates, right? So you might not be able to do that the first 6 months after graduation. You might have to wait a year or two. So I imagine interest rates will still be low then. The last thing you want to do is pull the trigger too quickly and then have something not go as planned, right? So again, give yourself a break, pace yourself, right? Start to watch your career unfold. And then when you have a better idea of what your income is going to look like, or you found your niche in veterinary medicine and you're pretty sure that your income's not going to be interrupted, then that's when you can go for that. But I would only do that when my debt to income ratio is less than 1, right? With federal student loans. We do have, I always forget to mention this, so the effective annual interest rate. So let's come back here and let's reset our simulation to something that mimics reality. All right, I'm going to take this and zero out the first year, and we're going to do the 47,000 for the second year and rerun this. So everybody gets hung up by the interest rate, right? So in this case, your interest rate on your student loan is 5.75%. And everybody looks at that and wants to immediately refinance their student loans. But if we run this simulation out and we see the total cost here was 245,000, right? I'm going to come back up here. 245,000 is yet total estimated cost. I borrowed 178,000, right? So I paid 245,000 over 20 years, which means I paid essentially $60,000 or so of interest over that 20-year period. If I average that out over a 20-year time frame, that comes out to an effective annualized interest rate of less than 2%. So again, before you get too freaked out by the interest rate on your student loans, run your simulations and look at this effective interest rate, right? Because this is essentially what you're paying in interest, right? The definition of interest is anything above what you borrowed, right? If I paid 245, I borrowed 178, that over 20 years is an extremely low averaged annual interest rate, right? So again, just know how this stuff works. A lot of times it works in your favor. Know if it works in your favor for you. Okay, deferment and forbearance. I've talked about this. You probably have already heard me talk about this if you've heard the climbing Mount debt in the past. Deferment and forbearance is one of the biggest killers of student loan repayment strategy. Don't use it, right? So I mentioned earlier that all of our loans right now are in administrative forbearance. That's different, right? This is the kind that people end up calling their loan servicer, and if they mention anything that has to do with income decreasing, they will immediately put your loans into forbearance or maybe a deferment, right? So you do not want to request that, right? The common scenarios for this to happen are internships, maternity leave, job changes, job loss. And this is just kind of the reflex reaction. But the problem is when your loans are in a normal deferment or forbearance, a non-administrative forbearance, they accrue interest. And once you come out of that forbearance, they take that interest and they add it to the principal, right? So that will increase the principal amount. It will increase the amount of interest that you accrue going forward. It increases the total amount of time and money that you pay towards your student loans, right? So forbearance doesn't count towards forgiveness. Deferment doesn't count towards forgiveness, and it can trigger this capitalization. Instead, if you experience one of these events, internships included, right, maternity leave, whatever, if you have a decrease in your income for any reason, just submit to have your payment lowered under an income-driven repayment plan. It can be all the way down to 0, right? It will still accrue interest during that time, but when your income goes up after that, they won't take that unpaid interest and add it to the principal, right? So you will not experience that capitalization event. Your principal balance won't grow, and you'll still keep the clock ticking towards forgiveness. So colleagues, don't let other colleagues defer their student loans, particularly if you're going to do an internship. Don't do it, right? And if you're working with some other residents while you're doing your internship, maybe that'll help you get a letter of recommendation for your specialty. Convince them to get their loans out of deferment, right? Because you'll save them thousands of dollars too. All right, so if you go back and do a residency, Master's of Public Health, PhD, there is an auto deferment, right? So like most of you experienced while you were in school, you didn't have to make any payments on your loans or even loans that you might have had before veterinary school. They were automatically deferred, right? The system is built to do that. If you're going to go back to school for any reason and you're going to be more than half time, then the system will want to put you back into deferment. I just told you that that's not good, right? So you can waive that deferment as long as you're in repayment and you tell them, hey, leave my loans in repayment. I don't want them to be deferred. I would recommend doing that. You'll keep the clock ticking and you'll prevent that interest from capitalizing. You might even be able to get your time spent during those experiences to count towards public service loan forgiveness as well. All right, so jumpstarting your financial plan. So if you haven't filed a tax return, file one, right? And if you haven't ever filed a tax return, this is a perfect time to do it, right? Because we do have, because of the COVID-19 and the CARES Act, economic impact payments. So stimulus checks are being sent out. So as long as your parents didn't claim you as a dependent on their 2019 tax return, by you filing a tax return, you can make yourself eligible for these $1,200 economic impact payments, right? So why not? You know, what's wrong with getting an extra $1,200 to get you jump started on your financial plan? Build your emergency fund, right? COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of why emergency funds are so important. Get to 3 to 6 months of your income or expenses, whatever measure is going to be easier for you to target. Build that emergency fund. Pay off those credit card debt. A lot of you indicated that you had credit card debt or you had other personal loans, some of them quite high, right? Use this flexibility that you have with the income-driven repayment plans to get that payment low enough so you can make a dent in the credit card debt and those private loans. The credit card debt, that's the stuff that makes building credit difficult, or building a sound financial plan. Credit card debt is very difficult to get out from under, right? Just because your student loan number is bigger than your credit card debt balance doesn't mean the student loans get higher priority, right? The credit card gets first dibs, right? First cut at paying down debt is that credit card debt. You don't want to keep that stuff any longer than you have to. Retirement savings, we're already a little bit late to the game, right? You spend a lot of time in school. We're going to have to play some catch up. 10% of your gross, ideally, if you have an employer that's offering a 401k or a matching retirement incentive, maximize those opportunities. In these early years here, maximizing Roth IRA contributions, right? You may exceed the income limits in a few years, depending on the type of practice that you're doing. So take advantage of that time you have now to max out those Roth IRAs. That's a better use of your money than paying extra towards your student loans. Right? And you want to make sure you take advantage of that window you have to do so. And that may only exist for a few years, depending on how much you end up earning. So max out those other areas, and that will have long-term compound returns for you. Save for a down payment on a home or practice. You can buy a home or practice with pretty much any amount of debt. I really haven't seen a maximum amount of debt that has knocked somebody out of the water for a home or practice purchase yet. Right? It really depends on how you're cash flowing, essentially, right? What does your monthly obligations look like? And do you have the room in your budget in order to absorb whatever that financing is? So you can buy a home and buy a practice, both, multiple, whatever, if you can make the cash flow work. And the income-driven repayment plans help you make the cash flow work. Start or expand a family, right? All of the stories that you read on the internet about people postponing having kids and buying homes because of their student loans, that's because they don't know how to manage their student loans, right? Don't be one of those people, right? Don't voluntarily pay more towards your student loans than you have to. But if you're going to manage your student loans based on your income, then be aware of the forgiveness, right? This is the one that keeps me up at night, right? I mean, I keep asking you all that are in repayment, when we do webinars for those folks that are in repayment, have you started a forgiveness plan? And the overwhelming majority have not, right? Time is your friend when it comes to forgiveness planning. The earliest question somebody asked when we started tonight was, how do I have 50% of my forgiveness fund when I have 17 years left towards forgiveness? Because I'm maximizing the time, right? I got started early and I started contributing more than I needed to in a more aggressive account, and I benefited from a really good stock market, right? That's how that works, right? But you don't want to be backed into a corner trying to save $60,000 3 years before you hit forgiveness, right? That's not going to go very well, right? So start and use that time to your advantage. So speaking of forgiveness planning, right? So we went through the forgiveness planning module. use that as a gauge to help you get started, you know, based on the amount that you think you're going to have forgiven. This gives you a suggested amount to start saving, right? And then what you choose to do with that is up to you, right? I mean, you can, you know, first things first. I mean, here, I'm going to go back to Bankrate, and they'll list out all of the online savings accounts that are offering various rates. Let's see, let's go to savings accounts. Right, however much you have to put in there. Maybe you've stashed away a little bit. Maybe you get your $1,200 stimulus payment. You want to put that in. You want to start that as seed money for your forgiveness fund, right? There are still online savings accounts that are offering 1.5, 1.7%, right? But you'll notice too in the simulator, we have a default of 3%, right? And that's kind of to prod you to maybe start thinking about things beyond just savings account. But you can, I mean, you can put it all in savings accounts, but it increases the amount that you have to save, right? That's very safe, and that's fine, right? But if you are willing to expand beyond that and, you know, increase the risk to try to get a little bit higher return, I mean, who knows what you could end up getting, right? And you may end up with more than you need. What a great problem to have, right? If I get the forgiveness and I owe $68,000 and I've got $100,000, oops, right? Now I've got $32,000 to do something else with. So, you know, have more, not less, if you can. Forgiveness planning kind of falls into that long-term planning horizon. Diversified investments, you can look at things like target date funds. I love the robo-advisors, right? They kind of do everything for you. These are things like Wealthfront, what's the other one? Betterment, Vanguard and Schwab have their own kind of robo-advising platforms now. I mean, there's dozens of these out there, right? They pretty much automate everything. All you have to do is feed them money, right? And you pick your risk tolerance. You can use certified financial planners, right? They're really good at helping you meet goals. I will caution you against asking them for student loan advice. We have found it to be variable at best, right? But if you go to them with a plan and say, look, I got this $46,000 target that I want to hit 20 years from now, that's when they can really help, right? They can help you craft a portfolio based on how much you have to contribute and your risk tolerance. That's what they're going to be very good at. Look for ones that are fiduciaries, fee-only planners. This National Association of Personal Financial Advisors, they are fee-only planners, right? Fiduciaries, people that are, they act in your best interest as opposed to making commissions off of products that they sell you, right? It sounds like it should make common sense, but that's a wild west of an industry, right? So just ask a lot of questions, you know, use resources like this to try to protect yourself from buying things that may benefit them, but not necessarily you. The part where it differs from retirement planning is that when your loans are canceled or forgiven, you're going to have to report that amount and settle up with the IRS on a very specific date, right? April 15th of that tax filing year, right? If I come up short on my retirement goal, I can choose to keep working, or I can scale back on what I was planning on doing on my retirement. If I don't have the amount I need when my forgiveness happens, I'm stuck scrambling to find some kind of payment plan with the IRS. And that's not a position I want to be in, right? I want to have more than what I need on hand when that tax comes due. So I don't have to even worry about what comes next, right? So you do need those funds on a specific date. If you know, forgiveness is going to happen once you hit the maximum repayment period, right? If you still have a balance remaining, it's not like you can call them and say, I'm not really ready for this year. Can we maybe push this back a couple of years? Like, there's no mechanism for that to happen, right? They're going to cancel your loans whether you want them to or not. And at that point, you just need to be able to cover the consequences. So I'm planning on, and this is why I've been a little bit aggressive on the front end, is I'm trying to get to my forgiveness target earlier than scheduled so I can scale it back and put it in very safe investments 3 to 5 years before I'm due to hit that, that tax bill. I don't know what the tax rates are going to be 20 or 25 years from now. Nobody does, right? But I can make some educated guesses. But I do have to follow along, look at tax policy, see how that's going to impact my forgiveness plan, good or bad, and adjust accordingly. All right, so for a few of you in the poll indicated that your jobs have been impacted, right? So whether they were canceled or your offers were withdrawn or rescinded, maybe some of you have even had start dates pushed back. A few of you indicated that. The CARES Act has some pretty beneficial and expanded unemployment insurance. Now, I know this is probably something that most of you are not very familiar with, but these are some pretty unfamiliar times. And in the expanded unemployment indicated by the CARES Act, if you had an offer of employment that was canceled because of COVID, you are eligible for this expanded pandemic unemployment insurance, right? So if you're not sure what you're going to do and you're kind of scrambling to find a job, in the meantime, if you had an offer and then your employer said, sorry, we can't honor this anymore, you can go to the unemployment office in your state and apply for unemployment and receive some income, right? So it's better to get that unemployment income than to not. So look into that, take advantage of it. There's actually on the vin.com/COVID, this is a free access page, right? You don't have to have a VIN membership to do this, but all of you do anyway, right? But you can access this even if you lose your VIN membership or expires in the future. All of this information is available there for you to review and look at how you can apply for unemployment if you need it, right? Again, this is not something I ever thought I would be talking to new grads about, but there's some weird stuff going on with it right now, right? So just know what your options are. There is some assistance available if you need it. Oh, I want to come back to this. We did a CE, I don't even know when it was, a couple Sundays ago. And a good point was made. If your offer of employment has been pushed to the future and you're not sure if it's going to happen, or you're really not sure what to make of that, and you're still struggling to make ends meet, it may be more beneficial for you to approach your employer and actually have them withdraw that offer so you can get unemployment. Right? If it's just been extended to some date in the future, TBD, something like that, it's probably going to be more difficult for you to obtain unemployment insurance from your state. But if you had an offer of employment and then the employer pulls it back and states it was because of COVID-19 or uncertainty or whatever, you're going to have a much better case for obtaining that unemployment insurance. I hope you don't need it. But again, some of you indicated that that has happened to you, so you do have that option available if you want to pursue it. All right, so coming down to the wire here. These are just a list of resources, right? So here's some COVID-19 resources on VIN Foundation. We've been tracking kind of the CARES Act, the impacts to student loans, and updating that accordingly. I'll probably do another one here to talk about the interest rates being removed from the files because I've been getting a lot of emails from those. VIN, all of you have an extended free student VIN membership, right? So the VIN membership has been extended, I think, to August. Normally it expires a month after you graduate. Because of the COVID-19, you all have access to VIN. If your employer or your internship or whatever your experience is after you've finished school here doesn't include VIN, you still all have access to it for the next few months, right? So we have a lot of resources on VIN. The COVID resources are free. There's a student debt folder on VIN, right, where we do personal consultations on your student loans. If this completely blew your mind or you're still just not sure how to get started, you can post in the student debt folder. You can even post anonymously in there, and we'll walk you through building a repayment plan, right? And the benefit of you posting in there is your other colleagues get to learn from that experience as well, right? And then you can keep posting your questions as they come up. We do a lot of those consultations in the VIN student debt folder. AVMA has some resources about income and a new grad center. The studentaid.gov is where you're going to find your file. There's some information on repaying loans in there too. Here's just some more of the links that I used throughout the presentation. We'll make this presentation available too, so you can click on or access those links. This is just to remind me in case I forgot anything. It's kind of hard. COVID-19 has been pretty much all day, every day for the last 2 months. So we're still going to have to watch that unfold, right? I mean, and you all are kind of on the forefront of what this is going to look like. You're going to be in a unique position to blaze the next trails, you know? Whatever veterinary medicine looks like on the other side of this, you guys are going to be at the forefront of it, right? So in that respect, it's kind of a opportunity, right? I mean, it's bizarre, but you may find better ways of doing things because you've been forced to do so, right? So necessity is the mother of all invention. So there's nothing more necessary now than figuring out ways to handle this new pandemic environment. We're going to see employer student loan payments, you know, maybe come and go. It was on the way up before the economy kind of hit the skids. I think that CARES Act provision was a way to maybe keep the momentum there. We'll have to see if that persists. Public service loan forgiveness, it's going to get better, right? Do not let those early returns dissuade you. I mean, if you're working towards, or you think you're working towards, or who knows, right? I mean, great example. There's somebody that we were working with recently, was a practitioner for a number of years and now is working in academia and finds himself in a position to qualify for public service loan forgiveness, right? But right out of the box, he had been paying really aggressively towards his student loans and now wishes he hadn't, right? So you never know what's going to happen. And I do think that taking a more measured approach to your student loan payment is going to serve you better in the long run. Production-based pay, your income is going to vary. But you can always use that adjusted gross income. But if your base salary is a little bit lower, you can always use that pay stub that shows your base and have the payment based on your base salary only, right? So you do have that option available. You have to go through your loan servicer in order to do that. That can be problematic because they're terrible, right? So you just do have to follow up with them and document everything that they tell you and ask lots of questions. Let's come back. Let's do some questions here. I think I did cover the stimulus check, right? So, yeah, let's come back and do some questions.
Okay, so this is the most popular question.
All right.
I've been on federal student aid website looking at possible repayment loans. VIN's calculators don't produce the same calculations as my federal student loan simulator. For example, on the VIN Foundation, my standard 10-year plan is 1,238 per month versus 930 on the FSA website. Do you know why this might be?
Yeah, you'd have to send me the specifics of what you entered in to that federal website, and I can compare it to the VIN Foundation one. I'm not really sure what they do on that federal student one. That was one of the reasons why we built our own, right? So sometimes it's hard to make sense of what that federal student calculator is saying or showing. But I would have to see the numbers that are going in.
Okay. Is it true that Grad Plus doesn't have a grace period? If so, is there anything special that we need to do to obtain that grace period?
Yeah, so Grad Plus, it doesn't have the same kind of grace period. It has a 6-month post-graduation deferment, which is essentially the same thing as a grace period. The benefit of that is that you don't have to wait for a Grad Plus loan to enter a grace period to consolidate it, right? You could start the consolidation pretty much whenever. However, you have to wait for your direct unsubsidized loans to enter their grace period in order for them to be included in the consolidation, right? So the rate limiting step is usually the direct unsubsidized loans. And it is very unusual to have direct Grad Plus loans without having direct unsubsidized loans, right? So by virtue of having direct Grad Plus loans, you probably have, or most certainly have, direct unsubsidized loans. So you're going to want to wait until those enter their grace period to start the consolidation.
Okay. I have loans from undergrad and have already used the grace period. When I consolidate, does this combine my undergrad and vet school loans? Do I have to consolidate before I graduate so that I won't have to pay for my undergrad loans right away while my vet school loans are on a grace period?
Yeah, so if you only get one grace period per loan, right? So if you've already exhausted a pre-veterinary school grace period, you can still consolidate them, right? You can still put them into the consolidation. And by virtue of the fact that you don't have any payment due because of the CARES Act suspension on those loans, they're not going to request any payment from you, right? So there won't be any logistical hurdles for you to climb in order to get those non-veterinary school loans into that consolidation this time around. Normally, if we weren't in a pandemic, right, you would have to call that loan servicer and say, hey, I'm going to put these into my overall consolidation loan, and they would just extend that deferment until that consolidation completes. So you wouldn't have to make a payment on those loans. But if you didn't make that phone call, you could conceivably have to make a payment on your student loans that don't have that grace period anymore while that consolidation is happening, right? But again, since the CARES Act is in place and you don't have a payment due and there's no interest accruing on any of those loans, if you start that consolidation loan, there shouldn't be any reason that you have to notify that previous loan servicer of that situation.
Okay, let's get another one here. A couple people are wondering if we can give them a copy of that student debt and income signalment form that they did.
A copy of the information in it?
I think so, yeah. The completed info.
I think I can probably do that. So this is that tool that we use to do that. I'm still getting familiar with, but I think I did see a way to email those results to at least people that provided their email address. So I think I can do that as long as you provided an email address. I can send you a summary of your inputs to that form.
Okay.
Let me look into that though. So I'm 90% sure I can do that, but I'll have to look into that.
The student loan repayment simulator has changed since I used it a year ago. There are now 2 categories for IBR, 2014 versus 2009. Can you touch base on the 2009 IBR versus other options, since I haven't heard much about the 2009 option specifically?
Yeah, good one. So yeah, we changed this a lot, right? Because things change. The first place to start is the income-driven repayment eligibility tab to see so you either qualify for IBR 2009 or you qualify for IBR 2014, right? So IBR 2014 is called IBR 2014 because the law changed in the student loan world, where if you were a new borrower as of July 1st, 2014, meaning you took your first loan, first federal student loan, after July 1st, 2014, then you would have access to the newest version of IBR instead of the older version, right? So IBR 2014 is a lot like pay-as-you-earn. However, there's one provision in pay-as-you-earn that makes pay-as-you-earn better than IBR 2014. So there's never a reason to choose IBR 2014 over pay-as-you-earn. And I am 99.9% sure that there is no way that you can qualify for IBR 2014 without also qualifying for pay-as-you-earn, right? So given the choice, I would always choose pay-as-you-earn over IBR 2014. But when in the simulator, you're going to see that they track very similarly unless you have an unexpected jump in your income and your debt to income ratio all of a sudden becomes much less than 1 during repayment, right? And that's because, I got to come back here to our table. That is because of this. Where's my highlighting tool? Let's use this guy. That's because of this nifty little provision right here. So when you use pay-as-you-earn, as long as you continue to provide your income documentation on time every year, even if you had a jump in your income where all of a sudden your debt to income ratio was much less than 1, it could trigger an unpaid interest capitalization. But pay-as-you-earn has a insurance protection against that. And if that were to happen, again, this is pretty rare that this even happens ever, but if you were to trigger the unpaid interest capitalization under pay-as-you-earn, the maximum amount that they could add to your principal is equal to 10% of the starting repayment balance, right? IBR, the new version of IBR, does not have that provision, right? So this pay-as-you-earn has more protections than IBR 2014 does. Other than that, they are exactly the same plan. So stick with pay-as-you-earn.
Okay. Any updates on how IBR payee will affect FA/FSA applications for future kids 18 to 20 years from now, if at all? Dr. Bartels mentioned it was hard to tell what the future impacts would be a few years ago.
Yeah, no, I have no idea. I mean, yeah, that's let's get through the pandemic and let's check back in that one in another couple of years.
Some
So
of my previous undergrad 2013 loans are saying payment due a month after graduation. Shouldn't these also be included in the CARES Act?
I would have to see more of that one. I'm not really sure. They as long depends on the loan types, right? So if they were, that's where I would go back and do that loan servicer check, right? So upload the file in there and make sure that they all say Department of Ed, right? If they don't say Department of Ed, then you could have a loan that would enter repayment if it's already been through its grace period after you graduate, right? Because the CARES Act only applies to those loans that are federally held, right? So they have to have this Department of Ed in the first part of the name here.
Okay. If we're doing additional schooling, like a PhD after vet school, should we still do all of this now or wait until finish that schooling?
Absolutely. No, do it as soon as you can, right? Because I have seen, and they are heart-wrenching, the people who roll right into a Master of Public Health or a PhD are the heart-wrenching ones, right? Because if you don't get that consolidation loan started, at least started, right? So it can get processed before you start school again. If you re-enter school before your grace period ends, your loans will be stuck in that grace period until you're done with that next part of schooling, right? And for some PhDs, that could be 7, 8, 9, 10 years, right? And that time could have counted towards public service loan forgiveness in some cases, right? So get those loans in repayment, into some kind of repayment, so you can refuse that in-school deferment after. You can't refuse it if the grace period hasn't been exhausted.
Okay. The loan balance on studentaid.gov is different than what my loan servicer reports. The difference being interest accrued. The loan servicer reports lower accrued interest and currently no interest accrual due to the CARES Act. The interest accrued on the student aid website is still increasing. Is this something that will cause issues in the future?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good, well, that's a good point. I think so the discrepancy there is that the data on student loan or studentaid.gov is a snapshot. And depending on when that snapshot was taken, it may have been from the end of March or the end of April, and your loan servicer actually has up-to-date information, right? So your loan servicer, that's one of their jobs, right? Is they keep track of the interest as of the date that you're logging in. The Federal Student Aid website only updates that information monthly or when something changes. So you will see that the loan servicer website has the most current information, but the Federal Student Aid website has the most comprehensive information, right? So they may not always align, and that's the reason why you're seeing a discrepancy between the file and the student aid and the loan servicer. I don't know. See right here, my loan information is as of the end of March, right? If I log into my loan servicer account, I'm probably going to see a different number here, right? Because it's going to reflect the CARES Act and any payments that I've made since then.
Okay, great. A couple people are wondering that they're let me find this. A few people are still confused between payee and repayee.
Okay, so let's come back over to our table. All right, so repay has a maximum, the major differences is repay has a maximum repayment period of 25 years. Pay as you earn has a maximum repayment period of 20 years. Generally speaking, the shorter you're in repayment, the less you're going to pay, right? So just by that comparison, pay as you earn is usually better. Repay, however, has a 50% unpaid interest subsidy. It's the only income-driven plan that has this bonus. If your income does not generate a payment sufficient enough to cover the interest, then you generate what's called unpaid interest. So let's say I have $200,000 of student loans and I accrue $1,000 a month of interest and my monthly payment is $500. Right? That means I'm falling short by $500 a month on the interest. Under the case of repay, the government will kick in $250 a month, right? So they will cover half of that unpaid interest balance each month. So that prevents that unpaid interest balance from growing as fast as it might under pay as you earn. However, you're still in repayment for 25 years versus 20. So sometimes you're going to still end up paying more in total than you get in benefit from that unpaid interest subsidy. The other kicker with repay is that you don't have the ability to separate your income from your spouse when you're married, right? Even if you file your taxes separately, repay, quote, closes the marriage loophole, right? Where a lot of people were pretty peeved that to have a lower monthly student loan payment, you could just file your taxes separately. So when they created repay, they said, okay, well, we'll give you the 50% unpaid interest subsidy, but we're not going to allow you to separate your income from your spouse if you're married. Right now, you can if if you're separated from your spouse, you're going through a divorce, things like that. There are exceptions to having to provide your spouse's income, but generally, if you check the box on the application that says you're married, no matter how you file your taxes, if you're using repay, they're going to want to know what your spouse is earning, right? So that's a pretty big downside when it comes to repay overpay. Like if you have both choices. When we can see repay benefit, so if we come back over here, is particularly in higher student debt balance situations, right? And I saw some pretty high student debt balance situations in the files that you sent me, right? So let's just test this out, right? So if you have an average income and a very above average student debt balance, you're going to start to see repay be less expensive than pay as you earn, right? And this wasn't actually high enough to do it. But it really comes down to the forgiveness planning, right? You can pay less in this scenario under pay as you earn, but your forgiveness savings target almost becomes another monthly student loan payment. Right? In those cases, sometimes we see people choose revised pay as you earn because it gives you the extra 5 years, it gives you the unpaid interest subsidy, and it decreases the amount that you have to save for the forgiveness and makes it a little bit more manageable. So in those really high debt to income ratio cases, repay can sometimes be more beneficial. Flip side, really low ones, right? So if you have one that's closer to 1, right? So let's say that I'm starting with a little bit above 1 on a debt to income ratio, and maybe I'm going to earn a little bit more than the average, right? This one comes up pretty frequently too. You can take advantage of those first 2 years if you want of that lower monthly payment just to kind of jumpstart that plan. But in these cases too, you can use repay, and as your income goes up, your payment will go up, and you'll actually end up paying a little bit less than you would using a plan like pay as you earn, because there's no cap, right? Pay as you earn, and now we're going to come back over to the table. Pay as you earn, you will never have a payment that's higher than the standard 10-year monthly payment, right? But your income can climb to a point where it switches to that standard 10-year monthly payment. Repay doesn't have that cap, right? It's always 10% of your discretionary income. There's no maximum, right? So in that case, you can end up paying more than the standard 10-year amount, which can help you pay the balance down faster, but you're still only paying 10% of your income. So repay in low debt to income ratio situations can be more beneficial than pay as you earn.
Okay. If we started the consolidation process form submitted, while our loans still say in school, for instance, a couple days ago when the official commencement is May 9th, will this consolidation process get rejected and we will have to reapply?
Probably. Yeah, I wouldn't submit it early, right? I mean, I'm almost certain that they're going to reject it, and it may take them 30 days to reject it, right? So I wouldn't submit that until I know that my loans are in their grace period.
And then somebody else is asking, would you make payments while you're waiting for your consolidation application?
No, absolutely not, right? Again, you know, by virtue of having student loans, that means that you can use all the cash flow flexibility that you can muster from the time between graduation, starting your new job, and getting your first paycheck, right? There's no reason to make payments towards your student loans during that time.
Okay. I was informed that it doesn't help to make monthly payments greater than the minimum due when using income-based payee, repayee, and it basically tells the government that we don't need the payment relief and it may affect forgiveness. Is this accurate?
Well, that's half of it's accurate, right? So it is true that if you're projected to hit forgiveness, right? So let's run this one a little bit higher. If you're projected to hit forgiveness, before I do that, just a warning. We're going to have to put some warnings in here. But if you have one of the files where your weighted average interest rate is 0, and you send this information over to the loan repayment simulator, make sure to update this, right? We don't have a way to automatically update it yet, but we're working on a way to do that, right? But take a guess at whatever your interest rate would have been, right? So 6% is probably a reasonable guess, right? So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to do the same thing that we've been doing earlier. And this is the value of running the simulations, right? If you keep running simulations, and no matter what numbers that you put in here, you keep bumping up against amount forgiven, right? You keep running up against a forgiven amount, then the most beneficial financial strategy is to pay the minimum and plan the forgiveness. It never makes sense to pay more, right? Because it's quite likely that you're not going to be able to pay more to not hit the forgiveness, right, without appreciably wrecking your finances, right? So in that case, if you're going to pay extra and still hit forgiveness, you're just going to voluntarily pay more towards your student loans than you had to, right? So the correct part is, if you're going to hit forgiveness, pay the minimum, focus on the forgiveness plan, right? Never makes sense to pay any more than you have to. You can test that out. We actually have a way in the advanced simulator settings for you to add additional monthly student loan contributions, right? And that'll play out. It'll increase the total costs if you contribute more towards your student loans, and you don't end up paying the balance to 0 before you hit forgiveness, right? So I would not recommend that. However, how much you pay towards your student loans is irrelevant to the loan servicer and your qualification requirements for income-driven repayment, right? As long as you're satisfying the minimum monthly payment, that's all they want, right? That's all that's required, right? If you pay more, doesn't mean that they're going to disqualify you in the future, right? That has no bearing on it whatsoever. Your monthly payment is based on your income, unless your income generates a payment that's beyond the standard 10-year balance. And when that's the case, they put your payment to the standard 10-year monthly payment, but you're still technically in income-driven repayment, right? So there's no scenario where the amount that you pay affects your ability to utilize income-driven repayment. Even if you were to pay $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, you had somebody that could afford to do that, to make those additional payments towards your loans each month, wouldn't affect your further income-driven payment plans. The payment amount is still going to be based on your taxable income, or you and your spouses if you file separate or jointly. I see. Well, I want to say I see Jennifer. She found the.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yeah. So I maybe I didn't point that out. Let me. If we go back here, if you go right. So if you apply for aid, sorry. Manage loans. That's what I do. If you go through the consolidation process, I forgot to point this out, but you will see the weighted average interest rate for the loans that they pull in here, right? So yes, here's your interest rates, right? So this is, to my knowledge, and thanks Jennifer for pointing that out, this is the only place that you can see your interest rates right now, right? Is in this little student loan consolidation portal, right? So go in there and grab them, right? And use that somehow. And they may not do the weighted average interest rate calculation for you, so you may just have to kind of ballpark it. But kind of look at the different interest rates on the loans that you have, and then when you come over to the simulator, you can fill in that interest rate if yours is one of the files that shows 0 currently.
Okay, someone asked, is it worth using repayee during an internship for the interest subsidy and then switching to payee afterwards if your income doesn't allow for the subsidy anymore? Would this reset the forgiveness timeline?
Yeah, so good thought. Been down that road. Financially, it doesn't pan out. Not in the case that you would still hit forgiveness, right? So unfortunately, when you switch plans, that's one of those triggers for capitalization. So all of the benefit that you get from the unpaid interest subsidy is eliminated because it increases your principal balance when you switch from repay to pay. So, but if you're going to do an internship and residency and you expect your income to exceed your debt when you finish your advanced training, then repay can be a great way to save yourself some money during that low income period, right? Because if you think about it, even with a $0 payment, the government's covering half of your interest, right? If you were to defer your loans or even use pay as you earn, if you're not making any payments, your interest is still accruing. So if you use repay and then you end up paying the balance in full before you hit forgiveness, it can really decrease the amount that you pay in total if you stay in repay, and presuming your income exceeds your debt when you're done with that advanced education, right? So I would only recommend that if your debt to income ratio is quite certain to be below 1 when you're done with your advanced education, right? But that sometimes that requires a little bit more of a crystal ball that I'm willing to play with. Perfect example, if you're heading into an internship and you have a student debt balance that's less than, I don't know, let's say 80 or 75, I mean, you're quite certain, hopefully, that you're going to earn something more than that when you're done with your internship, right? So that's a case where I would probably use something like repay.
Okay, a couple more here. If you're always allowed to pay more than your lowest monthly payment towards your loan, i.e. you want to try to pay it off faster, what's the point in choosing a shorter repayment date? Why not just the longest repayment time? Example, 20 years instead of 10.
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, let me illustrate that, because again, this has to do with how the income-driven plans work. It's the forgiveness that creates the discount. If I come over here to my $300,000 example, and I choose to use a standard 25-year plan, right? So I'm extending the payment to almost like a mortgage, right? Look at how much more I pay, right? So it's not just about paying the minimum. It's also about what happens at the end, right? It's the forgiveness provision that actually creates essentially the discount that we see with a lot of income-driven repayment scenarios. Just extending the payment and still paying the balance in full under a traditional scheme is going to cost astronomically more than using the income-driven repayment plan with the forgiveness provision, right? So in this example, pay and repay are in the low 300s, mid 300s. An extended 25-year plan is double that, right? And if I extend it out to 30 years, it's going to be even more, right? So it's the forgiveness provision and the tax, right? The fact that the tax is less than 100% is what creates this phenomenon, this discount phenomenon. I hope that answered the question.
I gave him the email just in case it didn't.
Okay.
Hopefully I worked. Somebody asked, why does the standard 10-year interest rate not match the standard 10-year effective rate since you paid it back?
Yeah, so because interest is not straight line, right? So the effective interest rate calculation is a straight line average. When you pay any loan back under a traditional repayment strategy, you pay more interest up front when the principal balance is higher than you pay when you get towards the back end of the payment. So the interest up front is higher, the interest on the back end is lower, but when you average it, it comes out to something a little bit lower than the stated interest rate, right? So it's just how we're averaging it in this calculation, right? Because a traditional repayment plan is not, you don't pay a straight line average over time.
Okay, what if we don't qualify for the forgiveness program?
I guess I'm going to need a little more information on that question.
Okay. Is the forgiveness after 20 years a guarantee?
It's in your contract, right? So if you want to come back over to our studentaid.gov portal, you have a master promissory note somewhere in here. Here it is. So your master promissory note, right, that's in your account, you can pull this up. Every time that you took a student loan, you check the box that says that you agree to the terms and conditions of this loan and to pay it back. All of these are baked into that master promissory note, right? So you have that contract. It is highly likely that they will honor that contract. Is it possible that they can tear up those contracts? It's possible. The probability of that happening is really, really, really low, right? I mean, there's 44 million student loan borrowers that have these contracts. So for them to tear up 44 million contracts is not going to go unnoticed, which is also why nobody's proposing to do that, right? So all of the proposals that are out there to change these plans are proposing to create a new loan, a new system for borrowers that haven't even started borrowing yet, right? So we are going to have the terms and conditions that are in place until there's no more of us to pay under those terms and conditions, right? So that's how they've handled these in the past, likely to be how they handle them in the future. It's as guaranteed as any other contract is guaranteed, right? So that's about as much as we can say on that. But I'm fairly confident that it's going to exist in some form in the way that it is. I mean, the wild cards are the tax rates, right? What happens to the amount that's forgiven once they hand it over to the IRS, right? That's the wild card. And that's where we might see some changes in the future. But I will also illustrate too that pretty much everywhere along the line here, since this income-driven experiment has been undertaken, everything that has happened to change them has been an improvement for the borrower, right? So there has never yet been anything that's happened to these student loan provisions that has made it worse for the borrower than it was before. So, you know, history does not guarantee future performance, right? We hear that on all the commercials for investing. But it does kind of indicate what is likely to be the case in terms of how they handle it going forward, right? I know a lot of our minds tend to go right to the worst case scenario and sometimes even scenarios that don't even exist. I'm going to bank on the probability that it's going to continue to happen as it's been happening and as it's written to happen.
Okay, just a couple more here. Someone says my loan servicer changed my actual graduation date to a later time. Is this typical? A result of COVID-19 changes? Should I make a call to correct this?
I would make a call to correct that. I have seen that, and particularly I've seen that for veterinary graduates at non-US schools. So I don't know if you're one of those, but I have seen that happen. But it usually is those foreign veterinary schools where that's the case. And you can usually get them to correct that or get your school to help you correct that.
Okay. One other. I was told for those entering into military service, Army Vet Corp, that we need to sell our loans to them. You know what that means? I can't get any good answers to that comment. Do they mean transfer to Fed loan, PHEAA?
I don't know that. I've never heard that. So I would have to hear some more details on that. I don't. I'm pretty sure that if you have federal student loans and you become a Army veterinarian, that you can work towards public service loan forgiveness, right? You don't. Now there could be another armed forces loan repayment benefit that lives out there somewhere that is handled differently, and in that case we would have to see more information on that. But I would want to compare that, if it's the case, versus something like public service loan forgiveness before I would do something like that. So I haven't heard that one come up before, so I'd have to get some more information from you to wade through that.
Okay. I think that's good. I think these other ones are somewhat similar and we can kind of go back, but I want to be respectful of people's times too. 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Right. These do tend to go long, right? I mean, it's confusing, and but this is where the rubber meets the road, right? So don't let this stop the questions, right? I mean, this is just really the starting point. So, I mean, you're going to start putting together your plan. More questions are going to come up. You're going to submit what you thought your plan was, and maybe your loan servicer is going to tell you something that blows that up, and then you're going to have more questions, right? So this is an iterative approach. It's really, it's a little bit of a steep learning curve, but after you do this for a couple of years, it gets a lot easier, right? So it's just like practice in that regard. Everything seems really scary and insurmountable at first, but once you get into a rhythm and you see how this works, it becomes much less scary, right? And when you have much more cash flow to work with, then you can start doing other things with it, and some of that stress around student loans, melts away.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. As we said before, you will all be getting an email with additional links, recording of this webinar, a PDF checklist, along with a link for the Prezi presentation and lots of other information. Just give us a couple days to get that all together. And if you have any questions, please email studentdebt@vinfoundation.org. And thank you so much, Tony. Any last words?
No, thank you, Jordan, for moderating and helping to set this up. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. Thank you, Paul and Matt, for helping to answer questions, and good luck to you all, right? I mean, again, you guys are, I know it's kind of non-traditional in every respect, but you are on the forefront of what is going to be the next version of veterinary medicine. So I look at that as kind of a bizarre opportunity, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.